Today we will be talking about antipsychotic drugs used in psychosis, right? Before we really talk about the antipsychotic drugs, we must know what is psychosis. So who will tell me what is psychosis? Yes, psychosis. What is psychosis? Psychosis is psychosis. Anyone knows more than that? Psychosis are severe mental disturbances in which there is loss, of contact with reality. This is very important, that psychosis is a group of severe mental disturbances in which the common thing is that there is loss of contact with reality, right? For example, there are some mental disturbances in which your contact with reality is intact, right? They are not psychosis. For example, if I get anxious, right? I have anxiety for long term, but patients who are having anxiety, they do have contact with the reality. They know what are the real things, what is the real world, right? So that is not psychosis, right? Such mental disorders in which you have the contact with reality as a loose group, they are called neurosis. So first of all, you must know what is psychosis before we really talk about the drugs, right? I'm defining them in a very easy way. Psychosis are more severe mental disturbances in which person loses contact with reality. Neurosis is a milder group of mental disorders in which patient has contact with reality. For example, anxiety is neurosis. Obsessive compulsive disorders are neurosis. Phobias are neurosis because people do have contact with reality. But when we talk about psychosis, these are very severe mental disorders, right, or mental disturbances in which patient loses the contact with reality. Can you tell me a few conditions in which there is psychosis, right? Of course, we are going to spend long time to talk about antipsychotic drugs, but first we should know what is psychosis. Psychosis develop as a part of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a special type of mental disturbance. Schizophrenia is called schizophrenia, schizophrenia, right? And there are many more different type of pronunciation, right? You can also have your private and personal pronunciation. I will, during this lecture, calling it schizophrenia, right? So schizophrenia is really a scientific mystery and personal disaster. It's a very severe mental disorder, right? And unfortunately, not rare. And schizophrenia is a very severe mental disorder or thought disorder, right? Patients' thoughts are very severely disturbed. Patients develop in schizophrenia very bizarre delusions. He may develop perception, severe thought disturbances, very severe thought disturbances in schizophrenia. Patient develop bizarre delusions. You know what are delusions? Delusions are firm, false belief, right, which are held by the patient in spite of the evidence to contrary. And these delusional ideas should not come from patients' socio-cultural religious background. Again, what are delusions? These are firm, false beliefs which are held by the person tenaciously, tightly, in spite of evidence to contrary. And these ideas should not be originating from patients' socio-cultural religious background. Is that right? Unfortunately, patients with schizophrenia have very, very severe type of delusions, right? delusional thoughts are there. Then they have severe problems with perception also. They have hallucinations, right? What is meant by hallucination? Hallucinations, perceptions without external stimulus. The patients who have schizophrenia, many of them develop very severe hallucinations, especially auditory hallucination. Especially auditory hallucination, they hear the voices which are not there for others. Is that right? Two types of auditory hallucinations are very, you can say, important in diagnosis. Number one, some of the patients may complain that they hear the voices which are having the running commentary on patient's thought and actions. You just keep on hearing, for example, right now you are attending the lecture and you keep on hearing why you are attending the lecture. Why don't you jump on the board? Why don't you kick a man behind? Why don't you roll on the this place? You keep on hearing voices, or you are writing some and you hear the voice. Why you are writing? Are you writing? Write it more clearly. Don't write on this page, write on the wall. Why don't you write on the wall? Of course, do you think you will have a normal life when you are hearing all these voices? So you may hear the voices which are having a running commentary on your actions and your thoughts. And second type of auditory hallucination, which is also very much diagnostic, that is when more than two voices are there, two or more than two voices are there which are talking to each other. And sometimes they are discussing about you. For example, two voices, Carlos may be hearing two voices, they are talking about why Carlos has short hair, why he does not shave his head, right? Why he does not bring the beard, keeps the beard, why he is attending the lecture, why he should not face to the opposite direction of the board, right? So do you think you will be happy or you will be disturbed by all these things? And you keep on hearing, isn't it? So this is very severe problems. Schizophrenia, these are severe thought disorders with very severe delusional problems. Patient may have paranoid delusions that all the time other people are going to damage him, or that is why under severe, some schizophrenic patients, some become violent because they have delusion that others are going to damage them. Is that right? So there are hallucinations, auditory hallucinations. Then there are also having another problem, right? That problem is about their speech. The speech may be incoherent, right? And there may be loss of fluency in speech. Sometimes they just offer you a word salad. You don't understand what they're saying, but they keep on talking the things, just like a salad of the different words, right? So there are severe thought disturbances, there are severe perception disturbances, there are severe speech disturbances, and of course, all of them translate into also severe behavioral disturbances. Many of these patients who are schizophrenic, they develop social withdrawal. They socially become withdrawn. They don't interact much with other people. They have their own private world, right? They develop social withdrawal. They lose their all motivations and goal-directed behaviors. Their level of self-care drastically goes down. They don't care for themselves, for their dress, for their cleanliness, right? This is very sad, isn't it? It's a personal disaster. And not only, and they develop severe mood disturbances also. Many of these patients, they develop mood disturbances also, or we call it affective abnormalities. Affect means mood, right? Affective abnormalities or abnormal affect. It is not with E, it is A. These are one of few spellings where I'm sure I'm right. Now, affect, disturbed affect, disturbed mood. For example, either, normal mood has a range of responses. You become happy, you become sad. And you show certain, intensity of emotions also, depending upon your feelings. But these patients who are schizophrenic, they develop flattening of emotions. What is flattening of emotions? Someone bring air out of emotions? Flattening of emotions. Flattened emotions are said to be there when person has reduced intensity of emotions. One person should be really happy, he's very little happy. And when he should be really sad, he's very little sad. For example, to schizophrenic patient, if you tell that he has lost his, or his wife has, filed for the divorce, right, he may not be bothered, right? Or if you say he got a, suppose, lucky draw, big amount, jackpot, he may not be significantly happy, right? Their emotional display is flattened, right? There's no significant fluctuation. Even the range of mood and emotions may be constricted also, right? The full spectrum of mood displays not only reduced in the spectrum and colors, but reduced in intensity also. Sometimes they are so much lost in their world that if you try to talk to the schizophrenic patients, you feel that communicating to them is very difficult. Many psychiatrists explain it in this way, that psychiatrists say when we talk and try to communicate to a fully schizophrenic patient, we feel as if we can see the patient can see us, but as if there's a very thick pane of glass in between the psychiatrist and the patient. Right? What is really meant by the schizophrenia? Splitting of the mind. Schizophrenia means splitting of the mind. Right? And most sad thing is, with all our medical advances, yet we don't understand this disease clearly. Yet we don't know how it really starts. We have many theories and hypotheses we will discuss, and we don't have any drugs which really alters the course of disease. Write down, all the antipsychotic drugs are just symptomatic drugs. They are symptomatic drugs. They don't alter the original disease process, yet we are not sure even what is the original disease process, right? Even though there are many theories and hypotheses, but antipsychotic drugs are a group of drugs which alter the symptoms of this psychotic disease, right? They don't alter the pathogenic process as such. Then one more sad thing about it, it's as common as diabetes mellitus. But you see the diabetic patient everywhere. You see them less often schizophrenic because families keep them away from you. They don't interact. Diabetic patient will talk to everyone, even they keep on mentioning sugar level is up, sugar level is down, right? These complications are there, but schizophrenic is not going to talk to you. Now my dopamine receptor level is up and now dopamine receptor level is down. He is not in touch with reality. He is not in touch with you, right? In families where schizophrenic patients are there, they try to keep their patients secluded or away or in some special sport circumstances, so they are not really much in the community and open in the community like diabetic patient. 1% of the world population has schizophrenia. It's a big percentage, 1%. Regardless of religion, regardless of social status, regardless of economic status and financial status, and regardless of geographical area, 1% of the world population is having schizophrenia. And sad things don't end up. One more sad thing is, usually, not always, but usually this disease starts when life should be the most beautiful, around adolescence. Adolescence is the age when you feel you are so strong, you can take over the world and you can achieve whatever you want. Unfortunately, 1% of the people around that age develop schizophrenia. Then one more sad thing. We don't have any therapy which cures them. There's no cure. Rarely a patient after the treatment with antipsychotics really become permanently okay. Most of them develop some residual, they have some residual disease, or they have recurrent disease or chronic disease. So again, what is schizophrenia? Schizophrenia is a very severe type of psychotic disorder, right? 1% of the population suffers with it, as common as almost diabetes mellitus, right? There are severe thought disturbances, severe perception problems, severe behavioral problems, right? And with that, patient has severe speech problems and sometimes even motor abnormalities. Some of the schizophrenic patient develop catatonia. You know what is catatonia? Not all, but some of them. These days we see less catatonic because we give antipsychotic drugs. Catatonia means that patient goes to assumes a particular posture and then maintains this posture. For example, patient become like this and then remains like this for many, many hours, right? Catatonia, abnormal motor situation in which person assumes the posture and then keeps it for long, long time, right? It is so sad. Then there are other types. Psychosis may also be part of some other diseases. As I told you, psychosis is part of the schizophrenia, but it may be part of some other disturbances. For example, psychosis may be part of very severe mood disorders. Very, very severe mood or affective disorder. Mood disorders are affective disorders. For example, person who is extremely depressed, or patient who is manic. And mania, when mood is extremely elevated, right? And mania also, when mood is very high, some people become psychotic, they lose the contact with reality. Manic patient may be telling you that he is going to buy the stars and distribute to you, right? Or manic patient may tell that he is going to buy all the airlines and provide every African child with one aeroplane so that he can come to USA and visit you. So you know there's something wrong, severely wrong with his thought processes, right? Mania. And severely depressed patient, extremely depressed patient may also lose the contact with reality and may become psychotic. Then psychosis may be part of some drug toxicity. There may be toxic psychosis. Some CNS stimulant drugs, if you take in large doses, they may produce psychosis. Amphetamines can produce psychosis. High doses of Levodopa can produce psychosis. PCP, what is PCP? Phencyclidine, have you heard of it? I think they call it angel dust or what? PCP, that can produce psychosis. So psychosis is simply the person loses contact with reality, isn't it? And classically, psychosis is seen as a part of schizophrenia, but it may be seen in severe mood disorders, it may be seen in some toxic states, patient develops psychosis or loss of contact with reality. So this was something basic about what is psychosis. Now we start talking about antipsychotic drugs. Yes, please.
In toxic psychosis, if you withdraw the drug,
Yeah.
the problem will continue? Or the
No, it will reverse. In toxic psychosis, if you withdraw the drugs which is inducing psychosis, most of the time psychosis reverses. Patient again establishes the contact with reality. Am I clear? Now we come to something about that when we are going to talk about the antipsychotic drugs, we will discuss that some drugs handle the positive symptoms of schizophrenia very well. And the other drugs which also manage the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. It means we must know what are the positive symptoms of schizophrenia and what are negative symptoms of schizophrenia, right? Let me tell you, what are positive symptoms? Rather, why don't you tell me the positive symptoms of schizophrenia and there are negative symptoms of, rather positive symptoms should be really red. It's a dangerous situation. And negative symptom where patient cool down. Yeah, there are positive symptoms of schizophrenia and there are negative symptoms of schizophrenia. It's easy to understand. Let's suppose this is a normal happy person, right? Unfortunately, if this person develops schizophrenia, right, there are few things which are added to his personality. The few things which are added to his personality. And there are few other things which are removed from the normal personality. When a person develops schizophrenia, there are few symptoms he develops in addition to his normal personality. And those symptoms which are developed in addition to his normal is called positive symptoms. And there are certain features which are eliminated or deleted from the normal personality, and then we say those symptoms are negative symptoms. Let me give you some examples. For example, if a person develops very severe delusions, this is something addition. Normal person does not have delusions. So these are added things. Added. So delusions must be considered positive symptoms. If some person is having auditory hallucinations, schizophrenic patient is having auditory hallucination, it is in addition to the normal life. So it is positive symptom. So delusions and hallucinations, which are the very florid symptom of the disease, are also called positive symptoms of the schizophrenia, right? And we'll later on talk, positive symptoms are managed very well by the typical antipsychotic drugs. Antipsychotic drugs are classically divided into two groups. Antipsychotic drugs, antipsychotic, I will explain later why they are in two groups, but for a while you just trust me, I'm right. The antipsychotic drugs are typical drugs, typical antipsychotic drugs, and atypical antipsychotic drugs, right? Typical antipsychotic drugs were initially discovered first. They were first discovered in classically we use the chlorpromazine, which we started using in 1960s, right? So typical drugs typically manage positive symptoms. So what you have to remember, typical drugs typically manage the positive symptoms. Is that right? Like they reduce the hallucinations, they reduce the delusions, right? Opposite to that, there are some negative symptoms also. Negative symptom, something missing from the normal personality of the person. For example, normal person should be social, but schizophrenic patients are socially withdrawn, right? Social withdrawal, it is a negative symptom. Social withdrawal. Normal person should be motivated in day-to-day life for some certain gains, right? These patients have loss of motivational behavior. Right? And with that, another negative symptom is loss of display of emotions. I told you there may be flattened effect. So the normal person is social, motivated by the right things, and normal person is emotional. Is that right? Actually, when severely schizophrenic patients were managed by the typical antipsychotic drugs, the positive symptoms went down, hallucinations disappeared, delusions disappeared, but patient was still withdrawn from the society, still not motivated to take care of himself or others. Still patient was not having a appropriate emotional display. So they said that additional thing of the disease are eliminated, but some losses are still there. So at that time the term was coined that typical antipsychotic drugs manage the positive symptoms very well, but then residual disease is still there as manifestation of negative symptoms. The beauty of atypical drug is that some of them are significantly effective in management of not only positive symptom but also negative symptom. That's the first point. Today we'll learn about the typical and atypical antipsychotic drugs. The typical antipsychotic drugs typically manage positive symptoms, but they fail to improve the patient's negative symptoms. And atypical drugs, which are now more modern drugs, right, they manage not only positive but also to some degree negative symptoms as well. Is that right? Yes. What's your question?
Why used to give typical drugs?
Oh, that's a very important question, that why we give still typical drugs. Answer is the ground realities of life. This is, let me give you another example first, then I will give you the cause. Everyone loves the most beautiful woman in the Miss Universe. Everyone loves. But do you think everyone marries? The ground reality is someone has to marry every type of woman. You don't understand it?
No.
Okay, listen. Every man likes the very beautiful and smart women. Do you think everyone end up with them? No. The ground reality is that somehow they end up with there are reasons they end up with not with those women who are their ideal. Same is true about women also. They may not end up with the most handsome and most rich men all the time. In the same way, ground reality about these drugs is that this is atypical drug is really very beautiful. It manages the positive symptoms, it manages the negative symptom, it has very less side effects. But unfortunately, many patients still end up with the typical drugs, especially who are treated in the public sector, because these are very, very inexpensive drugs. Ground reality of the life. Even psychiatrists know that person who is going to prescribe, he knows everything about that atypical drugs are better. But still, they keep on prescribing under certain circumstances typical drugs because they know that if they prescribe the atypical, right, maybe patient will never afford it or his family will never afford it. Patient will become totally mad or psychotic, right? Then human tragedy will be displayed in the house or in the public, right? So they give the drugs which are typical, less expensive, the ground reality of life. Is it clear? Any more question up to now? After this basic introduction, we really go to neurological setup, that what really happens in the mind and brain of the patient, what goes wrong. Actually, basic theory is around dopamine, that they believe that patients who are having psychosis or schizophrenia, they have increased dopaminergic activity in certain part of central nervous system, which is concerned with thoughts and perceptions. Those parts of the central nervous system which are concerned with thought and perceptions and behaviors, right, and with social activity, motivation, right. Now, let me tell you what are those parts. Let's suppose here is patient's central nervous system. Now we'll look for the tragedy. Of course, this frontal lobe. Now, what is really believed presently, that rather what was the real classical theory, that there is excessive dopaminergic activity in certain parts of the central nervous system. What are those parts? Important dopaminergic pathways are related with the limbic system of the brain and especially with the prefrontal cortex. You know, limbic system has what normal function? Limbic system is concerned with emotions, behavior, along with the temporal lobe it is concerned with thought processes, it is concerned with perceptions. Is that right? And let's suppose I draw the limbic system here. Of course, it's not an anatomical diagram. You just believe it is a limbic system. This diagram is representing all the structures of the limbic system, right? Which are some component of hypothalamus, some component of the temporal cortex, amygdaloid body, cingulate gyrus, and many other structures. Let's suppose this is the limbic structure of the central nervous system, which is concerned with emotions, behaviors, thoughts, recent memory, and along with the temporal lobe function, it is concerned with perceptions also. Actually, from the midbrain, there are special group of neurons which are having their projections going to the where? Limbic system. And these neurons are, yes, dopaminergic. All of them are releasing what? Dopamine on the limbic structures. These are dopaminergic neurons. These group of neurons are dopaminergic neurons. You really want to know this area? This is called ventral tegmental area. Ventral tegmental area in the midbrain, or mesencephalon, of course. And this dopaminergic activity or pathway or track, dopaminergic track, this is called mesolimbic track. Mesolimbic track or pathway, mesolimbic pathway. Am I clear? Now, this mesolimbic pathway is a dopaminergic pathway, right, which is connecting the mesencephalon with the, yes, limbic system, right? The classical theory, which is called dopamine hypothesis, according to that hypothesis, and I will tell you later what are the evidences for that hypothesis, that what's wrong in the disease process, that here is increased dopaminergic activity. More dopamine is released here, right? And the neurons in the limbic system, they are having here receptors for dopamine. What are these receptors? Dopaminergic receptors. These dopaminergic receptors are specially D2 receptors. Which receptors? D2 receptors. Dopaminergic receptors. These dopaminergic receptors are called D2 receptors, and D2 receptors are present presynaptically as well as postsynaptically in the limbic system. Is that right? Now, what is really believed presently that increased dopaminergic activity through mesolimbic tract, when it is chronically increased, that produces the positive symptoms here. That produces the delusions, that produces the hallucinations, right? This is increased dopaminergic activity which produces positive symptoms also. Mesolimbic tract. Now let me tell you something about dopamine receptors. Dopamine receptors are 5 types. 5 types. Of course, D1, D2, D3, D4, D5. And if this is one neuron, right? Let me show you how the dopamine works. This is one neuron. This is dopamine releasing neuron, right? And this is the next neuron. This is presynaptic membrane and this is postsynaptic membrane. This is dopamine transmission. Of course, once dopamine is released, it will act on the postsynaptic membrane, and on the postsynaptic membrane, the receptor is 7-pass receptor. What is this receptor? 7-pass receptors. Inside it must be coupled with G proteins. You know, all 7-pass receptors or serpentine receptors are coupled with intracellularly with G proteins. And there are presynaptic receptor also for dopamine, and they are also coupled with intracellularly with the G proteins. Is that right? Now, so dopamine work postsynaptically as well as presynaptically, right? Now, dopamine receptors are classically 5 types. D1, D2, D3, D4 and D5. Now, D1 and D2 receptors are coupled intracellularly with G stimulatory. They are coupled with G stimulatory. It means when dopamine acts on D1 receptors or D5 receptors in the target cell intracellularly, G stimulatory protein is activated which stimulate adenylyl cyclase, and that increases intracellular cyclic AMP. So it means the D1 receptors and D5 receptors are intracellularly, once they are activated, they increase the intracellular cyclic AMP, right? Opposite to that, D2, D3 and D4, they are coupled with G inhibitory protein. So when dopamine stimulates D2 or D3 or D4, intracellularly G inhibitory protein is activated. You know how G inhibitory work? Let's suppose this presynaptic receptor is D2. If this is D2 receptors, this is coupled with G inhibitory. G proteins are having alpha inhibitory component, right? And beta, yes, and gamma inhibitory component, right? When dopamine stimulate the D2 receptor stimulate the G inhibitory, the alpha inhibitory will inhibit which enzyme? Adenylyl cyclase. It will inhibit adenylyl cyclase. When alpha inhibitory will inhibit the adenylyl cyclase, then conversion of ATP into cyclic AMP is reduced. This is one result. That when D2 are stimulated, intracellular cyclic AMP levels are reduced. Secondly, this beta and gamma unit, right? They can stimulate potassium channels. These are called beta-gamma operated potassium channels. When potassium channels will open in the membrane, potassium is more in the cell or outside the cell? Yeah, cells are the bags of potassium. Cells are rich in potassium. So when beta-gamma unit open the potassium channels, potassium efflux start. Potassium efflux start. Thirdly, beta-gamma unit interact with the, what is this? Calcium channels, and they block these channels. So calcium influx is reduced. Is that right? Now let's see what will be the result of on the neuronal activity. What are the results on the neuronal activity due to these biochemical changes after dopamine action on the D2 receptor? Number one, again let's start from the beginning. Neuron is there is dopamine present on the neuron. D2 receptors, especially in mesolimbic area, D2 receptors are present presynaptically as well as postsynaptically, right? When D2 receptors are stimulated, they intracellularly stimulate G inhibitory protein. G inhibitory protein consists of alpha inhibitory, beta inhibitory and gamma inhibitory. Alpha inhibitory inhibits adenylyl cyclase and result in reduced level of cyclic AMP. When cyclic AMP levels are reduced, there is reduced activation of protein kinase A. When protein kinase A activity is reduced in this neuron, then phosphorylation of those enzymes which are concerned with synthesis of dopamine is reduced, because normally protein kinase A phosphorylate the enzyme which are involved in synthesis of dopamine. For example, tyrosine kinase enzyme. Now, when cyclic AMP is low, then protein kinase A is low, then enzyme for the synthesis of dopamine are not phosphorylated and they become slow down in their action. So synthesis of dopamine become less. This is one how there is auto inhibition by this pathway. Secondly, when beta and gamma unit of inhibitory system activate the potassium channels, there is heavy potassium efflux. Cell is losing the cations. So cell become more electronegative. When potassium moves out, cell become more electronegative. It become more polarized to the negative side. It become hyperpolarized. Right? So look here. If cell resting membrane potential was minus 90 millivolt, neurons resting membrane potential was minus 90 millivolt and threshold was minus 60 millivolt, threshold potential. Normally you have to take the resting membrane potential up to threshold and then action potential will start. All of you know that. Now, when potassium will come out, then cell inside will become more negative because it has lost the positive charges. So resting membrane potential from minus 90, it may become minus 95. So it has moved away from threshold. So it becomes easy to stimulate or inhibit? Difficult. Is that right? So in this way, it reduces the action potential than electrical activity in the neuron. Thirdly, normally when calcium goes into neuron, Look, when calcium goes into neuron, calcium the positive charges. Normally when calcium influx occurs, then calcium will take the resting minimum potential to threshold and increase the excitability of the neuron. Is that right? These beta inhibitory and gamma inhibitory negatively regulate the calcium channels. So cations cannot enter into neuron. So it is now difficult to stimulate the neurons. So what really D2 receptors are doing? The D2 receptors, once they are activated by dopamine, they reduce the intracellular level of cyclic AMP, and that reduces phosphorylation of many functional proteins, and functions of the neuron including the synthesis of dopamine is reduced. Secondly, it alters the electrical property of the neuron by leading to the cation efflux, by leading to the cation loss, that is potassium loss, and reducing the cation gain, that is calcium. So neurons under the influence of D2 action lose the cations and don't get the cations, so they become inhibited and dysfunctional. Am I clear? So this is the basic concept in the patient of schizophrenia, that what really happens, that there is excessive and dysregulated dopaminergic activity in mesolimbic pathway, and that leads to disturbed function of the limbic system, and that translates into positive symptoms like severe delusions, dysfunction of the neurons, and severe type of hallucinations and behavioral disturbances as well, psychomotor disturbances. Am I clear? Now there is another pathway which is equally important. There is one more pathway here, and this pathway is headed from the where? From mesencephalon to the prefrontal cortex. This is going from mesencephalon to the prefrontal cortex. Of course, good students know it. Prefrontal cortex is concerned with your personality. Your personality depends on lot of activity in the prefrontal cortex, because if prefrontal cortex is damaged, there are major personality changes. Is that right? Now, normally this pathway is also dopaminergic, and this is called not mesolimbic, this is called mesocortical pathway. This is called mesocortical pathway. Later on I will tell you how the drugs modify these pathways to correct that, to produce alleviation of the symptoms. This is mesocortical pathway. Actually, the modern concept is that in a healthy mind, there's a balance in these two pathways. There's a balance in these two pathways. The dopaminergic activity in mesolimbic pathway and other pathways mesocortical pathway. Right? Dopaminergic activity in mesocortical pathway. Right? This should be balanced. To have a normal personality, the way you are, all of you, thank God, right? You must be having balance in mesolimbic tracts and dopaminergic activity in mesolimbic system and balanced activity in mesocortical. Now, what is believed? There's a black box here. We don't know what happens here. We disturb the balance there. I say this is a scientific mystery. We are not clear what really happens here. We know there are some genetic influences, right? There's a genetic component and inherited component in schizophrenia. There may be some environmental factors. We are not clear. This black box for us. Pathogenesis of exactly this disease, we are not sure up to now with all our modern sciences. But we know there is something happening at this level which we yet to be discovered, right? But that something increases the activity in mesolimbic pathway and decreases the activity in where? Mesocortical pathway. So when mesolimbic pathway become overactive, you develop the positive symptoms. And when mesocortical pathway become underactive, you develop the negative symptoms. Right? Because motivation, social behavior, mood fluctuations. All these are strongly related with your personality and prefrontal cortex. So what really happens that one of the modern concept is, the sad part about the diseases which we don't understand is that every professor has his own theory, right? So one of the theory which tries to explain whole this process is that there is increased dopaminergic activity in mesolimbic pathway, right? And that leads to what? Yes? Positive symptoms. And probably there is decreased activity in mesocortical pathway, and that produces the negative symptoms. Is that right? Am I clear? And they think in this box, black box, what triggers the disease, probably this is not on dopamine, but there are glutaminergic pathways also there. I will talk about them later, glutaminergic pathway. And there are 5-hydroxytryptamine serotonergic connections which produce this imbalance. Now you will be able to understand very clearly that when we give the classical drugs, classical antipsychotic drug, they are anti-dopaminergic drugs. The classical antipsychotic drugs block the D2 receptors. Is that right? And when they block the D2 receptor, look here, they will block this activity and eliminate the positive symptoms. When you give classical, or you can say typical antipsychotic drug, that typically blocks D2 receptors. And when that blocks the D2 receptors, excessive activity, dopaminergic activity is reduced and positive symptoms are managed. But of course, that is not the way to manage the reduced activity here. There is already reduced activity. So do you think classical drugs which act by mainly blocking the D2 receptors strongly, do you think they can manage the negative symptom? They cannot. You can infer from this discussion, they are more effective in handling of the positive symptoms. Am I clear? Now let's go back to dopamine hypothesis. Dopamine hypothesis consists on this thing that in the central nervous system, whenever there is excessive dopaminergic activity, especially in the mesolimbic system, that translates into psychosis. And what is the evidence? There were multiple evidences in the favor of dopamine hypothesis, even though still it is considered imperfect hypothesis. Number one, the drugs, initially discovered drug, which was very good antipsychotic drugs, were all D2 receptor blocker. They were all D2 receptor blockers. Especially the typical drugs which were initially discovered, they were D2 receptors blockers. So doctors knew with their experience that antipsychotic drugs are dopamine receptor blocking drugs, so they inferred naturally that psychosis is probably due to increased dopaminergic activity. Is that right? That was one support to the dopamine hypothesis. Second support to the dopamine hypothesis was that if dopamine hypothesis is true, then the drugs which increase dopaminergic activity in central nervous system, they should produce psychosis. If dopamine hypothesis related with psychosis is true, then those drugs which can increase dopaminergic activity in central nervous system and toxic levels, they must produce psychosis. And with observation, it was proved right. For example, levodopa. Levodopa increases dopamine activity in central nervous system, and in high doses in toxic state produces psychosis. Then another drug is, of course, it's not really a drug, cocaine. Cocaine increases dopamine level in the central nervous system, serotonin levels in central nervous system, epinephrine and norepinephrine level in the central nervous system. Who knows how? Who is going to tell me how the cocaine works? Anyone who is interested in cocaine? Unbothered enough to know its mechanism of action, how the cocaine works?
It blocks reuptake.
Excellent. That's great. Let me explain what she is saying. Look, all the neurons which release norepinephrine, or the neurons which release dopamine, or neurons which release serotonin, 5-hydroxytryptamine, right? Dopamine, norepinephrine and serotonin, These three neurotransmitters have something common. They are originating from single amino acid modification. Dopamine is from tyrosine. Norepinephrine is also from tyrosine. 5-hydroxytryptamine is from tryptophan. So all these are derived of single amino acids. So these neurotransmitters are called monoamines. What are they called? Monoamines. Now those neurons which are monoaminergic, which are dopaminergic or noradrenergic or serotonergic neurons, they are very clever, you know. First you imagine, I love to play with the balls. Playing ball. What I do, that I throw the ball to the wall and I don't want to bother much. I have an elastic attached with the ball. I throw the ball and it comes back. Then again enjoy the ball and come back. And again play with the ball, come back. This is what these neurons are doing. These neurons throw the dopamine and then reuptake. There is a special mechanism which take it up back. They throw the norepinephrine and take it back. They throw the serotonin and take it back. They get the action, and 80% of the monoamines are reuptaken by the presynaptic membranes and restored to be reused. You understand the biological efficiency? Are you understanding how these neurons play with the postsynaptic membranes? They release the monoamines and reuptake. Claro? Now, what really happens, these reuptake proteins, I'm showing here, these are presynaptic reuptake proteins. These are monoamine reuptake mechanisms. Cocaine gets stuck here. Now you can understand. Do you think this protein can play now? That is what cocaine does. It puts stucks itself with the reuptake proteins in monoaminergic neurons. So neurons release the dopamine, but they cannot take it back. They release the norepinephrine, cannot recapture. They release the serotonin, cannot recapture. So in these synapses, there is increased dopaminergic activity, noradrenergic activity, and serotonergic activity. Is that right? And of course, if dopamine hypothesis is true, and increased dopaminergic activity produces psychosis, then high levels of cocaine must produce psychosis, and it does. So that is another support for dopaminergic hypothesis. Unfortunately, people who favor serotonergic hypothesis, they also have the evidence from the same cocaine. Is that right? Anyway. So then amphetamines. You have heard of something called amphetamines? Amphetamines are CNS stimulant. You know how they work? Anyone who knows amphetamines, how they work? That actually forces the increased release of monoamines. When you take amphetamines in large doses, they increase the dopamine release, norepinephrine release, and serotonin release. And if dopamine hypothesis is true, then high doses of amphetamines must produce psychosis, and they do. So what are the evidence for the dopamine hypothesis? Evidences mean what are the supportive observations which prove that increased dopamine activity is related with psychosis. Number one, antipsychotic drugs which were typically discovered initially, they were all antidopaminergic. Number two, the drugs which increase in the CNS dopaminergic activity lead to psychosis. Number three, evidence that patient who were not treated with the antipsychotic drugs, on their death, when they did postmortem studies on their brain, slices of the brain, they found increased dopaminergic activity in increased density of dopamine receptors in limbic system. Right? So you can say in living patient also, and in postmortem studies also, they found that in mesolimbic system, there were increased dopaminergic receptors, concentration or density. Is that right? No question? Then another evidence. You know dopamine breakdown into which compound? Dopamine breakdown, its breakdown metabolite is yes? Homo what? It's beautiful because homovinilic. HVA, homovinilic acid. This is the breakdown product of dopamine. They have seen that when they treat the patient of psychosis with typical antipsychotic drugs, homovinilic acid level go down as the patient improves. They have seen as the patient of psychosis improves with the drug treatment, the homovinilic acid goes down, levels of homovinilic acid goes down in CSF, in blood, and even in urine. That is another support that when HVA levels are going down, patient is improving, coming out of psychosis. So this is another evidence, probably psychosis were related with excessive and disturbed activity of dopaminergic pathways. Am I clear? Let's have a break now.
What happens to the
Right. So we were discussing about the antipsychotic drugs, and I mentioned many times that antipsychotic drugs are primarily divided into two groups, typical and atypical, right? Few words about that, and then we'll continue with our discussion in central nervous system and dopaminergic system. That antipsychotic drugs, right? They are basically, yes, you will tell me, typical, which are also called classical, right? And there are atypical or also called modern drugs, right? Recent drugs. Now, typical drugs, typically, they are D2 adrenergic receptors antagonist, right? And atypical drugs, because they are not typically working only on these, so usually it is mentioned that atypical drugs are working mainly, they are 5-hydroxytryptamine, right? 2 receptor antagonist, right? This is an answer from an average student, that an average medical student will say typical drugs are D2 antagonist and atypical drugs are 5-hydroxytryptamine, that is serotonin 2 receptor antagonist. The real answer should be that they are also D2 antagonist. All antipsychotic drugs are D2 antagonist. All antipsychotic drugs are D2 antagonist. Typical drugs strongly bind and with the D2 receptors and for longer duration. Atypical drugs also bind and block the D2 receptors, but in a mild way and for transient duration, right? So actually, typical drug have very strong affinity to block the D2 receptor. Atypical drug have weak, they also block the D2 receptor, but with weak affinity. The tendency to bind with the receptor and block is for transient time and weakly. And in addition to that, they are having serotonergic receptor blocking activity. Is that right? We'll see that these concepts have very big implications, not only on the therapeutic actions of the drug, but these two concepts are also important when we talk about the side effect profile of the drugs. Is that right? So for a while, we'll come back again to discuss the typical and atypical drug differences. We'll go back to how the drugs work in the central nervous system. Right now, I'm concentrating on the typical drugs, right? We go back to our diagram. Now, few things we have already discussed. This was our limbic system and this was our, yes, which cortex? Prefrontal cortex. We have already discussed that there was ventral tegmental pathway, right? And this ventral tegmental pathway was originating ventral tegmental area. It was originating, yes, mesolimbic, and from similar area nearby there was also origination of cortical. Is that clear? And overactivity here was concerned with positive symptoms, and underactivity of dopamine system here was concerned with negative symptoms. No problem up to here. Right. Now the problem is this: when we are giving the typical drugs and they're blocking the dopaminergic pathways, the dopaminergic activity, unfortunately, not only they block here, but they also block in some other dopaminergic pathways and produce some other unwanted actions. Let's see what could be the other actions. Because when you give the drugs, typical drugs, they will block the dopamine receptors, D2 receptors, right? But not only they block in the mesolimbic pathway, but they will also block in other dopaminergic systems in brain. Now, what are other dopaminergic systems? A very important dopaminergic system starts from substantia nigra. Have you heard of substantia nigra?
Yeah.
Right. So substantia nigra is present where? In the midbrain, in mesencephalon, right? In upper part of mesencephalon, it is having upper and lower both. In the midbrain, there is substantia nigra. Substantia nigra has neurons which are dopaminergic, right? Now, dopaminergic neurons also come from substantia nigra, right? And these neurons specially go to the basal ganglia. This I'm making the basal ganglia. It's not really an anatomical diagram. Basal ganglia or basal nuclei, these especially I'm concerned right now with the putamen and the caudate. You know, they are very important in regulation of the movements, putamen and caudate. So from substantia nigra, there are dopaminergic pathways which are going to, yes, basal ganglia. And which basal ganglia? Those basal ganglia which are striated, So this pathway is called nigrostriatal pathway. What is this pathway? Nigrostriatal pathway. These group of neurons which are projecting from substantia nigra to the striatum, right, which are part of the basal ganglia, this pathway is called nigrostriatal pathway. Now, nigrostriatal pathway is very important as a part of extrapyramidal motor system. You know, motor system is divided into pyramidal motor system and extrapyramidal motor system, and pyramidal motor system start from cortex and goes down as corticospinal pathway. Is that right? Pyramidal. Extrapyramidal system is mainly controlled by the basal ganglia, right? Now, in the basal ganglia, for normal function of the basal ganglia, there has to be a very good balance between two activities: dopaminergic activity and cholinergic activity. This is a very important concept. If basal ganglia has to work in a normal fashion, then within the basal ganglia, dopaminergic and cholinergic system should be in balance. Am I clear? Now, when you give these drugs, right, D2 blockers, dopamine receptor blockers, of course they not only work where we want, they also work unfortunately on the dopamine receptors in striatum and block those receptors also. So it means that when you are giving your typical drugs like chlorpromazine is a typical drug, haloperidol is a typical drug, right? So when you give chlorpromazine or haloperidol, or especially haloperidol, very tightly blocking the D2 receptors, right? So these drugs block the D2 receptors, and D2 receptors are present heavily in the corpus striatum, or they are present in caudate and putamen, or simply they are present in basal ganglia. Is that right? Now, so it means nigrostriatal pathway will be working more or less in the presence of these drugs. Less. Actually, dopamine will be released by the nigrostriatal pathway, but dopamine will not be able to act on its receptors, and there will be reduced dopaminergic activity. What is there? There is reduced dopaminergic activity where? Yes, in the basal ganglia. When a schizophrenic patient is given typical drug reduces dopaminergic activity in basal ganglia. Of course, when dopaminergic activity is reduced, cholinergic activity is unopposed. Then cholinergic activity is no more opposed by dopaminergic activity because both of them are opposing each other, balancing each other. When you give antipsychotic drugs, typical antipsychotic drugs, in the basal ganglia, dopaminergic activity is reduced and cholinergic activity becomes unopposed. Due to that reason, it comparatively increases. And this imbalance produces problems with the motor system. Is that right? This imbalance of dopaminergic activity and cholinergic activity in basal ganglia, which result due to typical antipsychotic drug, right? That results in very important and severe motor side effects. Those motor side effects which result due to this imbalance activity of neurotransmitter in basal ganglia, those side effects as a group are called extrapyramidal side effects. Extrapyramidal side effects. EPSE. Extrapyramidal side effects are the most important side effects, one of the most important side effects, group of side effects related with antipsychotic drugs, especially with the, which one? Typical. And here it's very easy to infer that atypical drugs don't bind strongly with D2 receptors. So atypical drug do not disturb strongly nigrostriatal system. So atypical drug do not produce significant extrapyramidal side effects. So this is a very big difference in typical and atypical. The typical drugs typically bind with the D2 receptor strongly, and typical drugs produce extrapyramidal side effects with a high incidence. But atypical drug, right, primarily as it is mentioned that it is more blocking the serotonergic receptors, but they do block the dopaminergic receptors also, atypical drugs, but transiently with less affinity. So what really happens, now listen very carefully, that I'm going to draw a circuit here. This neuron going over there. This is dopaminergic neuron and releasing dopamine here. And this is the neuron present in striatal system. Now this is your striatal system connection here. Nigrostriatal pathway bringing the dopamine, and dopamine is supposed to work here. Is that right? Of course, there's no fun in mentioning it as 7-pass receptor, right? Now, dopamine is going to work over here. When you have a typical drug, that will tightly bind here. And when it will tightly bind here, right, now what will be the result? First, try to understand how dopamine is normally released. Dopamine is released in two fashions. One is the neurons all the time are trickling down a very small amount of dopamine. That is called tonic release of dopamine. What is that? Tonic release of dopamine. But when action potential comes, when you want to make a purposeful movement, there is a big surge of dopamine release. Again listen. Dopaminergic, nigrostriatal dopaminergic pathway and many dopaminergic pathways, they are releasing dopamine in two fashion. Number one, when neurons are not stimulated by action potentials, still they release extremely small amounts of neurotransmitters. This is called tonic release of neurotransmitter, right? So dopamine is tonically released also there. Plus, dopamine is released in heavy amount like a big dopamine surge when you want to make a voluntary purposeful movement. Is that right? If this basic information is clear in your mind, let's apply it with the drugs. Typical drugs tightly bind here. So they block the action of the tonically released dopamine, plus they are so tightly binding there that even when dopamine surge comes, it cannot displace the drug. So this system becomes dysfunctional. Basal ganglia system becomes dysfunctional. But when we talk about atypical drug, they also bind here but loosely and transiently. They may disturb tonic a little bit, but whenever you want to make a purposeful movement and dopamine surge comes, it displaces the drug. That is why typical drugs have more extrapyramidal side effects and atypical drugs have less extrapyramidal side effect. Another beautiful point here. But here, there are also dopaminergic pathway release of the dopamine and then the next neuron, and this is a dopamine receptor. Is that right? This is dopamine receptor here. Now listen carefully. Here is dopamine receptor. Now, presently it is believed that in case of psychosis, please listen with your both ears. In case of psychosis, presently it is believed there is increased tonic release of this system. The excessive dopaminergic activity is due to tonic activity. Now, tonic activity is blocked by typical and atypical, both. Are you understanding? Tonic activity is blocked by the typical and atypical, both. So what does it mean? It means typical drugs and atypical both will be antipsychotics. Again listen. Typical drug block D2 receptors strongly at mesolimbic system as well as at nigrostriatal system. Typical drug at both sides bind with the receptors strongly. Atypical drug also block the D2 receptor along with serotonergic receptors, but they bind with the D2 receptor loosely and transiently with low affinity. They bind here with low affinity as well as bind here also with low affinity. Now, psychosis is probably due to excessive tonic activity of dopaminergic system in mesolimbic tracts. So, because these receptors are typical drugs as well as atypical drugs, both are blocking the tonic activity here. So both of them act as antipsychotic. Is that right? Opposite to that, when you come here, typical drugs bind strongly and they block the tonic as well as surge. Atypical drug may block the tonic but do not block the surge. So here, side effects will be more by the typical drugs and less by the atypical drug. You know, it's so funny that no one asks that why we call one group of drug typical and other cause atypical. One reason is that doctors believed that good antipsychotic drugs should be typically producing extrapyramidal side effect. Initially, when antipsychotic drugs were being discovered, they said any drug which is producing extrapyramidal side effect must be antipsychotic. So they thought that a typical antipsychotic drug must produce extrapyramidal side effect. Later on, they found there were some other drugs which could they were not producing extrapyramidal side effect. Still, they were antipsychotic. They say these are atypical drugs. Then they found one atypical, then another atypical, and now they're looking for where are more atypicals. Because they are good for the patients. Patients have less extrapyramidal side effects. Am I clear? Let's come back now. We have to talk about what are these extrapyramidal side effects, which are produced more by the typical drug and less by the atypical drug. Even Rina knows now. Good. Now, it depends on about 80% of the patient eventually develop some of the extrapyramidal side effect. It's a big number, percentage. Now, the different types of effects which appear. Number one is some of the extrapyramidal side effects are produced acutely by the use of the drug, and others are produced by the chronic use of the drug. Within few hours of giving the drug, thank God, only some patients develop a very, very acute reaction to the drug, and that is called dystonias. Dystonias. Have you seen the patient with torticollis? You have not seen a patient with torticollis. I will show you right now. Actually, sometimes when you start antipsychotic drugs, some people within few hours or days, they develop severe type of dystonias. Look here how the dystonias occur. Patient become like this. And now he cannot make his posture okay. My God, I did it too much without drug even. Anyway, so patient become like this or like this. I think my dress will be also. Okay. Now, so these are acute dystonias. Many patients develop it. Why they develop problem like this? Basal ganglia are concerned with posture regulation also. These are postural muscles, neck and back muscles. So this imbalance may disturb. Basal ganglia have many areas. Some are regulating the posture, some are regulating the onset of the purposeful movements, right? So the basal ganglia have many motor functions. In some patients, within few hours of giving the antipsychotic drug, especially when antipsychotic drug is given parenterally. Someone comes with very severe psychosis and you give injection of chlorpromazine. Not, of course, not all patients, otherwise we will not use these drugs. But some patients may develop acute dystonias. Is that right? What are acute dystonias? These are very severe spastic contractions in the postural muscles, right? Like torticollis. Now, so acute dystonias may develop within as early as within few hours, right? So this is one problem. This is extrapyramidal side effect, right? Then some people, they don't develop this, but they develop a different problem. After a few days, not few hours, but after a few days, they develop a different type of problem. They develop akinesia. What is your concept of akinesia? Do you know Parkinson's disease? Akinesia is a part of Parkinsonism. Actually, they may develop Parkinson's-like syndrome. Parkinson's-like syndrome. And this may occur within few days. Within few days. That you have started the drug, a patient is brought with a family to you, and patient is unfortunately schizophrenic. You put patient on the typical drug, and after a few days, patient is brought back to you. He looks like a patient of Parkinsonism. You know what is wrong in Parkinsonism patient? Typical disease of Parkinsonism, nigrostriatal pathway degenerate, right? And patient develop in Parkinson's disease, patient develop typically akinesia or hypokinesia, rigidity and tremors with mask-like phase, right? Now, what is akinesia? Akinesia or hypokinesia mean difficulty in initiating purposeful movement. Person has neuromuscular junction neurons, okay, motor neurons are okay, motor nerves are okay, neuromuscular junctions are fine, muscles are also healthy, but patient finds difficult to initiate motor movement. Is that right? And that is called hypokinesia or akinesia, right? So this is seen typically in Parkinson's disease. This may be seen due to antipsychotic drugs, right? The patient is sitting, then it is sitting. Patient wants to stand up. Patient has the willpower, but he is surprised that his system does not follow. Is that right? He is unable to initiate a purposeful movement. Even in Parkinson's it happens. First they find it difficult to walk. And if they are walking, sometimes they find it difficult to stop because they have to activate another set of neurons to stop the movement. Did you get it? This is very sad. So, hypokinesia. Secondly, rigidity in the muscle. Flexor and extensors both become hypertonic. And tremor. Hypokinesia is typically due to reduced dopamine activity, and tremors are due to unopposed cholinergic activity. Is that right? Why it is so important that in Parkinson's disease, if hypokinesia is a real problem, you give levodopa in Parkinson's disease. Never give levodopa to patient with patient with psychosis. And in Parkinson's disease, if patient has dominantly tremors, you give him anticholinergic drug. And if patient has both, then you give Levodopa with anticholinergic drugs. Anyway, this is Parkinson's disease. Now we come back to our discussion that unfortunately some patients who are on the typical antipsychotic drugs, they may develop Parkinson's-like syndrome, typically akinesia, right? So they will come to you and they have reduced movement and they have mask-like face. What is meant by the mask-like face? They are having that Spider-Man mask or what? Mask-like face means that, when you look to someone, his expression little bit fluctuate depending upon the like you or dislike you or whatever, right? So doctors are used to this thing. When patient come to them, their expressions, everyone shows some expression which fluctuate, isn't it? And if you have difficulty in initiating of the movement of the facial muscles, can you have fluctuating facial expression? No, patient will have, right? Mask-like face. You are talking to the patient, you are asking how are you, is like looking like that to you, like a toad face. You have seen the face of a toad? Special type of frog. You have not been looking at frogs. Okay. Anyway, so what I'm talking about, that these people have toad-like face, or you can say mask face. So I remember one patient when we started, there was a young man about 22 years old and he was brought to the psychiatry department and he was having this schizophrenia, unfortunately, and he was having hallucinations and delusions. So he was very much, his expressions are too much because he was talking to the voices and he was saying, I'll kill you, I will fight with you, you cannot kill me. I mean, it was a very sad situation. We gave him the drugs and after 3 weeks he was brought and he was just like this. And talking, walking like this. And parents were unfortunate, mother on one side and father on the other side. It was very sad, right? And we knew it is due to our drugs, right? So, akinesia may appear within few days. Then there are some patients who develop after a few more weeks and months, right? Another problem. And what is that problem? That is akathisia. What is akathisia? Anyone? This is motor restlessness. When you're very angry, can you keep sitting on the chair? You start moving around and you become restless. Unfortunately, these patients become motor restlessness. They develop motor restlessness without anger, right? The basal ganglia system is disturbed and they cannot really keep sitting. Of course, akathisia will be developed in those patients who are not having akinesia, right? So it doesn't mean every patient develop every problem. Some patient may develop dystonia, some other patient may develop akinesia. Still, some unfortunate other patients may develop akathisia, right? Akathisia takes, you can say, weeks to months. This was days to weeks, and this is weeks to months. All these are extrapyramidal side effects. So patient may develop akathisia. These patients keep on moving their leg or arm. If you force them to sit, so they sit and move over like this. The restless, right? Then we come to the last but not the least, a very bad side effect of use of what? Typical antipsychotic. That side effect is called tardive. Tardive means late, slow. Tardive dyskinesia. Dyskinesia. Dyskinesia means dysregulated movements which occur in a late phase of treatment. They develop over months and years. Months and years. They develop due to chronic use of antipsychotic drugs. And unfortunately, because this disease is chronic, most of the patients, these drugs are used chronically. And some of these patients may develop tardive dyskinesia. Now, what are tardive dyskinesia? First, I tell you underlying problem. Actually, dystonias Echinaceias and akathisias, they are all due to reduced dopaminergic activity. But tardive dyskinesias are due to, yes, increased dopaminergic activity. Now we are giving antipsychotic drugs. Dopaminergic activity should be reduced. Why in these patients there is increase? Do you have the concept of that if you keep on blocking some receptors for a long time, receptors become upregulated and they become tissue becomes super sensitized? Do you know that? Okay, that's good. So what really happens that when you are using D2 blockers, typical antipsychotic drugs for a long time, what really happens that when these receptors, D2 receptors are blocked in the basal ganglia for many months and years, right, then the postsynaptic membranes express extra receptors and postsynaptic membranes develop super sensitivity to dopamine. Is that right? Are you understanding me? Right? It's just like that, a woman who is missing her husband for many years, she will become super sensitive to his sound. Hypersensitivity. Otherwise, when you talk too much to your wife, she becomes downregulated, especially after the marriage. Is that right? This is normal things, everyone knows that, right? That overstimulation leads to downregulation and understimulation leads to upregulation. So receptors are like you, right? The D2 receptors, when they're blocked for a longer time, they become super sensitive. When they become super sensitive, even very small amount of dopamine, which is having a chance to work in spite of the drug, may produce dysregulated movement, tardive dyskinesia, remember. In all first three cases, by decreasing the D2 blocker, improves the situation. Here if you decrease the drug, transiently situation gets worse. Are you understanding it? Again, I will repeat. For example, you are giving the patient chlorpromazine, and due to D2 receptor blocking, patient develops these first three side effects. If he is developing any one of these side effects, you reduce the dose of chlorpromazine, extrapyramidal side effect will be reduced. But if you have given chlorpromazine for many months and years, and eventually patient has developed tardive dyskinesia, it means dopaminergic receptor system is upregulated and oversensitive in the basal ganglia. Now, when tardive dyskinesia appear and you reduce the dose of chlorpromazine, patient will get worse, because some of the upregulated receptors which are blocked by the chlorpromazine, they will be also become available for abnormal action. Is that right? Am I clear? Usually still we reduce the dose. And another funny thing, usually we still reduce the dose, and to calm down the patient, we may give diazepam and switch the patient to atypical drugs, right, in tardive dyskinesia. But important thing is, again listen, attention please. It's a very interesting concept that in first three extrapyramidal side effects, decreasing the dose reduces the side effect, and increasing the dose, if someone has dystonia or akinesia or akathisia due to chlorpromazine, and if you increase the dose of chlorpromazine, side effect will become less or more? It will become more. Look, these side effects are due to blocking of dopamine receptor. Who is blocking the dopamine receptor? Chlorpromazine. For example, I'm the psychotic patient. You give me chlorpromazine, I develop dystonia, right? If you reduce the dose of chlorpromazine, I become better. Or if unfortunately you are really against me and very bad, you increase the dose, my dystonia become more severe. Is that right? But in tardive dyskinesia, it opposite occurs. That when you reduce the dose, patient gets worse. And when you increase the dose, patient becomes transiently better. Because here receptor system is super sensitized. When you increase the chlorpromazine, for a while patient will become better, because chlorpromazine is blocking the D2 receptors. Am I clear? No problem? Why you all of you look so serious?
Is that because of tolerance?
What?
I mean, is that what they call the patient develops tolerance? So they have to like give a higher.
No, it is not that thing. Look, yeah, actually this patient is having excessive receptors. And due to that excessive activity of dopaminergic system, patient is having tardive dyskinesia. So if you give extra dose of the drug, extra drug receptors will be blocked. So for a while patient will feel better. But then he will bring up more upregulated receptor and again get tardive dyskinesia. Am I clear? So again, this is very important point that in extrapyramidal side effects, these early side effects are reduced by the drug reducing dose and increased by the increasing dose. But tardive dyskinesias are increased by reducing dose and decreased by increasing dose. And some people believe that they are almost irreversible problem. Right? Now, what are tardive dyskinesia? What happens to patient? I've told already, in dystonia, patient will develop some dystonic feature. Akinesia, patient cannot make purposeful movement. Akathisia, patient become motor restlessness. What happens to patient in tardive dyskinesia? Tardive dyskinesia is more common in elderly female especially, of course, who are on this drug, right? Now, tardive dyskinesia, what patient is doing? How you know that your patient has tardive dyskinesia? Anyone? Have you heard of this term or never heard of it? Improper movements. Every improper movement is not tardive dyskinesia. Many elderly women may make improper movements and they are not tardive dyskinesia. They may be due to some other disease or some other reason. Anyone who knows tardive dyskinesia, this is a very embarrassing situation, especially for the patient family. There's some senior female in their family and she's having, look, these are a chorioathetoid orofacial movement, right? For example, this is an involuntary movement. The elderly female is sitting. Do you think anyone like his elderly female in the home? Any guest come and she start doing things like that? Right? This is tardive dyskinesia. These are involuntary, unstoppable orofacial movements. Right? Lateral movements of the jaws or smacking of the lips and fly catching movement of the tongue and so many other varieties of movements around this area. Right? So these are tardive dyskinesias. Am I clear? No problem up to this?
Why is just a question? Why is this extra pyramidal side effect? Why it's called that?
Okay. Right. He's asking why these side effects are called extrapyramidal side effect. Let me tell you very briefly. You know that you have a central nervous system, right? These are lower motor neurons. These are lower motor neurons which are going to the muscle, right? Now, some neurons come from the motor cortex or premotor cortex, right? And come to lower motor neuron. This is called pyramidal system because it passes through the pyramids of medulla. These are pyramidal pathway. All other pathways which are going from higher level to the lower motor neuron are called extrapyramidal pathways. Now, extrapyramidal pathways are from red nucleus, rubrospinal pathways, olivospinal pathways, reticulospinal pathways, tectospinal pathways. There are multiple pathways which are coming to the lower motor neurons other than the corticospinal. As a group, they are called extrapyramidal. All these pathways are regulated by basal ganglia. They're under the influence of basal ganglia. So we can say basal ganglia is the headquarter of extrapyramidal system. Extrapyramidal system is responsible for three things. I hope you're not taking my test in neurology. Okay, thank you. So extrapyramidal system has three functions. Number one, posture regulation. Number two, it is controlling the tone. Number three, it initiates, it helps in initiation of purposeful movement with the pyramidal system. Because to initiate a purposeful movement, you need pyramidal and extrapyramidal both. And extrapyramidal is especially important in maintaining the tone of the muscles and posture of the body. Is that right? Now what really happens that in these all problems, any one of these components or in any combination that is disturbed. For example, here tone becomes disturbed. Here patient finds difficulty in initiating the movement. Here patient is unable to keep his system rested. Right, again motor movement disturbed, which is involuntary. Tardive dyskinesia, again patient is having motor programs which are leaking out. Is that right? So do you think this is purposeful? Patient is doing with purpose, so it cannot be pyramidal. Is he doing purposefully? So it cannot be pyramidal. It is also not purposefully, so it is not pyramidal. It is not purposefully, it is not pyramidal. So all of these have to be Is that clear? So all of them as a group are called extrapyramidal side effect. Am I clear? Right? And this is one of the major group of side effects by the typical antipsychotic drugs. Yes?
Does it have atypical that's not
Yeah, he is saying that do these effects occur with the atypical that often? Answer is no.
that's often.
Least often. The reason being that atypical drugs, even though initially look, scientists are also learning the way we are learning, but they are learning at little bit advance of us. Actually, scientists thought initially that every antipsychotic drug must be typically producing extrapyramidal side effect. Because in the beginning, the drugs which were initially discovered, more a drug is potent as antipsychotic, more strongly it was producing extrapyramidal side effect. Later on, they discovered the drugs which were still antipsychotic but not producing extrapyramidal. Underlying mechanism which is now discovered is that atypical antipsychotic drug also block the D2 receptors, right? But they bind with the D2 receptors here very loosely. So when you want to make a purposeful movement, a surge of dopamine comes and drug is displaced. So drug-induced extrapyramidal side effects are not produced or they are less, right? Just to remember that atypical drugs have less extrapyramidal side effect and more weight gain. Many patients still don't like these drugs which are atypical drugs because they increase the weight. We'll talk about that thing later. Any question up to this? There's no question. Now, one more serious problem I would love to discuss. That is life-threatening complication. Thank God, rare, but it happens, right? That is malignant hyperpyrexia, or more commonly, that is called neuroleptic syndrome. That is also a side effect. Neuroleptic syndrome. What is neuroleptic syndrome? Let me tell you, and then I will tell you how it develops. Or first I tell you how it develops. Okay. This syndrome develops in those patients who are super sensitive to dopaminergic receptor blockage. There are some people, as you know, some of you are emotionally super sensitive. In the same way, some patient may have basal ganglia which are super sensitive to blockage of D2 receptors. Now, a person who is super sensitive to the blockage of D2 receptors, sometimes when such patients are given injections, usually parenteral drug, but it can occur with oral also, they are given typical antipsychotic drugs, they develop very, very dangerous type of syndrome. What happens in that syndrome? All the muscles become strongly contracted and rigid. That is called catatonia. Patient goes into one frozen position and he will hold himself in that position for a long time. We call it catatonia, and severe contraction of the muscles. Number one. Very, very severe contraction of muscles. When you develop so much severe contraction of the muscles, then what happens? You produce a lot of heat. In the body produces a lot of heat. Patients start developing the fever. Plus breakdown of muscles may occur due to severe and prolonged contraction. Myoglobin as a breakdown product of muscles may appear into urine. Patient may develop myoglobinuria. Then there is an enzyme in the muscles which leak into blood. Creatinine CPK, creatinine kinase, phosphokinase or kinase. So muscle creatinine kinase level goes dangerously high in the blood. Myoglobinuria starts. Patient has a very strong contractions of the muscle. Patient develop autonomic fluctuations. Blood pressure may become unstable, right? May go up or may go down. Heart rate fluctuates. With that, patient's capability to regulate the temperature is reduced because, temperature regulating center is in hypothalamus. Good. Temperature regulating center is hypothalamus. That also has dopamine receptors. If those are blocked, patient is unable to regulate the temperature, unable to sweat. So body is producing more heat and unable to dilate the vessels, unable to produce a sweating, so temperature goes up and it may go dangerously up. So very high grade fever, strongly contracted muscles, myoglobinuria, high levels of CPK in the urine, in the blood, high levels of CPK in the creatinine kinase in blood, fluctuating autonomic nervous system and fluctuating and progressively deepening conscious level. Patient is going to, conscious level is going down. Patient become drowsy and then patient become, even some of these patients may go eventually into coma. And even 10 to 20% of patient, if not treated, may die. Is that right? This syndrome is called neuroleptic syndrome, right? How do you treat it? The first step is don't give any more drug, which is the cause of the syndrome. That's the first thing. Don't stay the course, right? Stop the drug, number one. Number two, stop the antipsychotic drug. Number two, you give dantrolene. Have you heard of dantrolene? Dantrolene is a drug which helps the sarcoplasmic reticulum to take up the calcium from cytosol. Dantrolene. Dantrolene. You give the dantrolene, it's a very specific drug for this situation. It helps the sarcoplasmic reticulum to accumulate the calcium from the from the cytosol of the muscle cell. So actin-myosin relax. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Am I clear? Right? Calcium is taken up and restored into sarcoplasmic reticulum. That's the function of dantrolene. With that, we can give some dopamine agonist. Because this syndrome occurred due to dopamine receptor blockage. Right? And if he is really very high temperature, you can do some cooling, physical means to bring the temperature down. Alright, so neuroleptic syndrome, let me repeat it. This is one of the life-threatening situations which may develop sometimes, thank God very rarely, in the patients with typical antipsychotic drugs. It develops in those patients which are very, very sensitive to dopamine receptor blockage.
And that's only in chronic stage or acute too?
It is acute. Alright, no one develop neuroleptic syndrome.
Stage with the drug.
Yeah.
The drug for many years.
No. It develops in the early when you are starting using the drug, because patient has a tendency to develop neuroleptic syndrome. Right? So you will discover it at the early phase of treatment. Yes, please.
What's the other name for neuroleptic syndrome? You said hyperpyrexia?
Malignant hyperpyrexia. Actually, malignant hyperpyrexia is a term which is used for any condition in which temperature of the body becomes very high. But malignant hyperpyrexia, which is due to antipsychotic drugs, typical antipsychotic drug, is called neuroleptic syndrome. Right? So again, in neuroleptic syndrome, muscles go into extreme contraction, they are injured, there is release of myoglobin into urine, CPK in the blood, body temperature goes up, autonomic nervous system is fluctuating, conscious level fluctuate and then start going down, right? And untreated 10 to 20% patient have a risk of death. Am I clear? Let's have a break. So all this is the cost of reducing the dopaminergic activity in the mesolimbic system, so that patient should develop the contact with the reality. But you are taking the risk for extrapyramidal side effects and you are taking risk for this. And unfortunately, you are taking more risk. We'll talk about that after the break. Now we continue with our discussion with the other dopaminergic pathways in central nervous system which may be affected by the typical antipsychotic drugs. We have already discussed that antipsychotic drugs reduce the dopaminergic activity in the mesolimbic pathway, and that is the basis of therapeutic action of the drug, that it is reducing the degree of psychosis, especially it reduces the positive symptoms. We have already also discussed that unfortunately these D2 blocker drugs not only block the mesolimbic pathway, they unfortunately also block nigrostriatal pathway, and that may result in extrapyramidal side effects. Now we will talk about one more dopaminergic system in the central nervous system and in pituitary relationship. You see in this area of the central nervous system, this is called Yeah, hypothalamus. Here's anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary, and this is hypothalamus, right? Let me draw this hypothalamus in larger way. Anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary, infundibulum, hypothalamus with mammillary body. Is that right? This diagram I made it here. Now what really happens, all of you must be knowing that in the anterior pituitary there are cells which produce prolactin, right? Prolactin producing cells which are present in anterior pituitary, they are called lectotrophs. So these are prolactin producing cells which are present in the anterior pituitary. Prolactin producing cells are always kept tonically inhibited until prolactin is required. Now, how they are kept tonically inhibited? Basically, okay, let me make it more clear. This is infundibulum, and there is special vascular channels between hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. These are hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. Hypophyseal hypothalamic portal system. Now what really happens, there's a nucleus here which is called arcuate nucleus, right? And this has a neurons, and these neurons are dopaminergic. They are releasing dopamine, and dopamine from these neurons, right, comes in through this portal system to the anterior pituitary. And there, dopamine work on dopaminergic receptors which are present on prolactin producing cells. This is normal physiology what I'm talking about right now. That, what is this area of the hypothalamus? It is above the infundibulum. This is called tuberoscinerium. Tuberoscinerium. Now, this pathway is called, because from the tuberous, this is tuberous area, this is mammillary area, this is infundibulum, and this is anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. Whole this is called tuberoinfundibular pathway. What is called? Tuberoinfundibular dopaminergic system. Dopaminergic system. In this system, arcuate nucleus, which is present in tuberoscinerium or lowest part of the hypothalamus, this arcuate nucleus keep on releasing dopamine, and dopamine is brought to the anterior pituitary, and this keeps the lectotrophs inhibited. So what is the physiological function of dopamine here? That it inhibits the production of prolactin. Now, when you give typical antipsychotic drugs, they unfortunately block these receptors as well. Here. And when these receptors are blocked, what will happen? Then what really happens is dopaminergic receptors are blocked, and dopamine is unable to inhibit the prolactin production. So there will be excessive production of prolactin. So the patients who are on typical antipsychotic drug may produce large amount of prolactin. That is a big problem. Now this high amount of prolactin or hyperprolactinemia produces troubles in males and females both, right? In the females what happen, that when this prolactin will act on breast, that may produce galactorrhea, right? Number 2, high amount of prolactin will suppress the FSH and LH production. So FSH and LH will not be produced enough to activate the ovaries. And of course, when follicles are not developing in ovary, Graafian follicle is not formed, corpus luteum is not formed, estrogen and progesterone is not enough, uterus is not properly cyclically responding, and there's amenorrhea, right? So what really happens that the females on typical antipsychotic drugs may develop hyperprolactinemia amenorrhea syndrome. What is the syndrome called? Hyperprolactinemia, amenorrhea syndrome. And they become infertile. Of course, amenorrheic female, and she is not fertile because ovary is not cyclically responding, right, to FSH-LH, because that production of FSH-LH is suppressed by hyperprolactinemia. So this is one thing. That secondly, female libido will go up or down? Libido will go down, number one. How the female libido will go down? You're mistaken. Female libido depends on what? On androgens which are produced by female. Libido does not depend on estrogen and progesterone. Libido in male and female in both depends on androgens. Males have lot of androgens because they produce androgens from testes, plus males produce androgen from adrenal cortex. Females produce androgen only from adrenal cortex. That is why female have less libido as compared to male. They don't get as wild as we get, right? I don't know if it's good or bad, but anyway. So they have less androgens, and those androgens are coming from adrenal cortex. Is that right? So females' libido is not decreased significantly, but the good point is that they don't get pregnant, right? It's good for the psychotic female or bad? It's good. A female who is having schizophrenia and she's under treatment, it's not the time to get pregnant and have a baby and raise the baby. She's not fit for that, isn't it? So this side effect may not be that big side effect for a female, but anyway, she developed hyperprolactinemia with amenorrhea, infertility. Libido may not be affected that much. But when we come to a male patient who is schizophrenic, right? When he is on typical antipsychotic drug, he also develops hyperprolactinemia, and with that he may develop gynecomastia. Of course, he is not very proud of that. Secondly, male also develop decrease in libido, right? Because when males also have high level of prolactin, that will suppress FSH-LH release, and that will reduce the function of FSH-LH as gonadotropic hormones. They not only stimulate the ovaries, but in male they also stimulate. In males, FSH-LH stimulate testes. So when testicular function goes down, so naturally male also become infertile, and there's reduced libido, and there is. Do you think it's good for female to have significant reduction in libido or not when he is psychotic? It's great that he should have reduced libido, otherwise he will be causing tragedies around here and there, and he may be a source of big troubles himself, right? So males develop reduced libido, gynecomastia, infertility, and another problem, which is we are not sure why it occurs. Many of these patients on these drugs have weight gain, right? Weight gain is one of the important unwanted result of antipsychotic drugs, right? Now we know that these drugs are dopamine receptor blocker. We know how they act on the mesolimbic system, how they act on nigrostriatal system, how they act on tuberoinfundibular system, and eventually increasing prolactin release, right? Another thing very interesting, that even though in female this hyperprolactinemia, amenorrhea syndrome is good in one way, that she is not going to be pregnant, but pregnancy tests become positive. Isn't it funny? That female who is on antipsychotic drug, she is not going to be pregnant, right, because she is amenorrheic, but pregnancy test become positive, false positive. It should be false positive. High level of prolactin, right, that gives pregnancy test positive, right? So, but this is false positive. That is the good news, right? Then we come to other dopaminergic system. Which other dopaminergic system is there? A very important dopaminergic system is here in the chemotrigger zone. You know there is something called fourth ventricle. You know that, right? And fourth ventricle. This is spinal. Okay. This is foramen magendae. In the medulla, in the floor of the fourth ventricle, here is a special area which is called chemotrigger zone. Neurotransmission in chemotrigger zone is also dopamine dependent. The neurons in chemotrigger zone, you know there is area postrema. In the fourth ventricle there is area postrema where blood-brain barrier is broken. So neurons here are exposed to many constituents of the blood, and if there is some noxious substance present in the blood, that may produce a feeling of nausea here and vomiting, right? Nausea and vomiting. So because this area is triggered by the chemical substances, so it's called chemotrigger zone. It's sensitive to carbon dioxide level also. But anyway, this chemotrigger zone has a lot of neurons which are dopaminergic neurons. So when this chemotrigger zone is stimulated by some noxious substance, dopaminergic neurons fire and produce feeling of nausea, and they may start the vomiting also. And the good news is that these antipsychotic drugs also block the dopamine receptors here and down-regulate the activity of, reduce the activity of chemotrigger zone. So these drugs can act as antiemetic drugs. That is a beneficial action. Right? One of these drugs, promethazine, is used as antiemetic drug. Is that right? So what did we learn up to now? Let's sum up. Let me draw a diagram related with the what is it? I think he needs some ophthalmologist. What is this? This is antipsychotic drug. Typical antipsychotic drug. Right? Now, with this domain, it can block what? Dopamine. This is D2 receptor blocker. Is that right? This domain. Because this component of the molecule, this blocks the dopamine receptor. We already know, we have discussed it so many times. It has good effects and bad effects. Right? Well, good effect is antipsychotic action and yes please, psychotic action and antiemetic action. And bad effects are extrapyramidal side effects, increase prolactin, these two problems, right? So basically this part of this finger, this domain of the drug, this is dopamine receptor blocker, right? Then unfortunately this drug, typical drugs have unwanted domains also there, some other unwanted domains. For example, this domain. This domain blocks alpha adrenergic receptor. And if it blocks alpha adrenergic receptor, it is an unwanted action. When you give someone typical antipsychotic drugs like chlorpromazine, let's suppose this is chlorpromazine, right? Typical antipsychotic drug. So it will block the alpha-1 adrenergic receptors. Now what is the normal function of the alpha-1 adrenergic receptor? It has many functions, but at least you are supposed to know two functions. One is that alpha-1 mediated vasoconstriction. It is a vasoconstrictor drug. And alpha-1 receptor is vasoconstrictor. Number two, alpha-1 receptors help in male ejaculation. You know, erection is parasympathetic activity and ejaculation is sympathetic activity mediated by alpha-1 adrenergic receptors. Is that right? Now, when you give someone drugs like typical antipsychotic, what they will do, they unwantedly, they may block some of the alpha-1 receptors in the body. So when vascular alpha-1 receptors are blocked, that may produce hypotension. Postural hypotension, right? And many of these patients, when they develop postural hypotension, we have to give them fluids, saline, at least to bring their blood pressure back. Postural hypotension is one of the side effects of unwanted, of course, action. Secondly, in males, in some of the male, Alpha-1 receptor blockade may lead to ejaculatory failure. Ejaculatory failure. I think many of them don't mind that much because already their libido is less and they are less action. Right? But if there's some action, then they will develop ejaculatory failure, some of them due to alpha-1 receptor blockade. Right? Then you see it has additional fingers and additional actions which are again not wanted actions. For example, due to this domain, it can block muscarinic receptors. Of course, these are cholinergic receptors. And do you think it's a good news or bad news for the patient? It's a bad news, especially for elderly patient. Right? Why? Because when muscarinic receptors are blocked, then acetylcholine dependent activities are inhibited. Especially acetylcholine dependent muscarinic activities are inhibited. Do you know what are those activities? Can you tell me? Number one, central nervous system has cholinergic receptors. You know, cortex has cholinergic receptors. Cerebral cortex. Oh, yes. And cholinergic pathway here throughout the cerebral cortex help you for two things. Number one, orientation. You are aware of, right now, you are aware of self and the surrounding. You are aware of, you are well oriented in time, place, and person. Is that right? Those neuronal circuits which make you aware of time, place, and person, what is the time, what is the day, what is the year, who you are, who are the people around you, where you are, right? All these things. So you are well oriented in time, place, and person. This function is done by cholinergic pathway in the cerebral cortex which are stimulating the muscarinic receptors. And this drug may block those muscarinic receptors. And when it may block those muscarinic receptors, then it may produce disorientation and confusion. Because patient may not remain well oriented in time, place, and person, and it may produce confusion and plus forgetfulness. Forgetfulness, yeah. Actually, this is a basic principle. All the antimuscarinic drugs which can enter into central nervous system, they produce forgetfulness and impaired memory, you can say. They produce impaired memory with impaired orientation in time, place, and person. Am I right? But old people are not happy with this drug. They get confused, they get forgetfulness, whatever little they remember in psychotic state, even that may be forgotten. And then more sad news are coming. You know, this is the cholinergic system which drives the GIT and urinary bladder. This is a cholinergic system which drives the gastrointestinal smooth muscle and detrusor. So what really happens? Detrusor, of course, the muscle of the urinary bladder, not gallbladder, right? Now, so what really happens when the muscarinic receptors are blocked, GIT smooth muscles are not having enough cholinergic muscarinic stimulation, patient may develop constipation and even retention of fecal matter. Do you think old man will be happy with this? That's another unwanted side effect. Right? Fecal retention. And more sad, GIT is a big volume, maybe you can retain somewhat fecal matter extra. The real tragedy is when cholinergic system fail on the urinary bladder due to muscarinic receptor blockage and patient cannot urinate, and that may end up into urinary retention. Do you think it's good? Especially for elderly male, they are very unhappy because they may have benign prostatic hyperplasia that may be already producing some troubles with urination at the top. Detrusor does not contract due to cholinergic muscarinic failure. You must be thinking, it's better to have schizophrenia or better to have this drug? This drug has a lot of side effects, right? And yet story is not over. It has one more unwanted domain. What is this one? This was D2 domain, right? And this was alpha blocker domain. And this was your muscarinic blocker domain. Here is histamine receptor blocker domain, H1 blocking domain. So this drug may also unwantedly block the H1 receptor in CNS, and that may produce sedation. Is that right? Sedation is good in the beginning when patient is very agitated and disturbed, right? So that may be good to relax the patient, put the patient somewhat sedated, right? But in the long run, if sedation stays there, that may be, when patient gets better, his functionality may be impaired, right? So these drugs also produce sedation due to two reasons. One reason of sedation is histamine receptors are blocked. Second reason for sedation is alpha-1 adrenergic receptors are blocked, because when you are excited, in the CNS, epinephrine, norepinephrine is released. And when that epinephrine, norepinephrine excites you through alpha-1 adrenergic receptors, and if those are blocked, of course, degree of excitement in the CNS is reduced, and that adds to sedation. Am I clear? Sure? And this finger I will break, because this was for what? This was to block the serotonergic receptor, which is not blocked by typical drugs, right? What really happens, this is a little finger which was for blocking 5-hydroxytryptamine drug, right? What is the difference in typical drug and atypical drug? You know what is the difference? In typical drug, this becomes big finger and all other fingers shrink. That is it. Are you understanding? In atypical drug, listen, this is a typical drug. In atypical drug, again listen carefully, in atypical antipsychotic drug, this finger becomes more active. This blocks 5-hydroxytryptamine receptors, right? And all these histamine blocking, muscarinic blocking, alpha blocking activities reduced. Good news, bad news? Good news. Even this finger works in a different way. It does not work in a very intrusive way to the receptor to block, or not in a very, you can say, strong way. It also works a little bit on the D2 receptors. That is even good. The little bit action on D2 receptors, transient action, may be enough to produce antipsychosis, but may not be enough to produce extrapyramidal side effects. So let's draw the atypical drug here. This is atypical drug, right? It leads to weight gain, right? And little finger is big. 5-hydroxytryptamine blocker is really powerful, but histamine blocker is less. What was that? Muscarinic blocking is less. Alpha blocker is less. And this finger, what was this? D2 blocker. It is really vibrating. It's not permanent. It's moving like this. It can be easily displaced. Is that right? We'll continue the lecture tomorrow. Now, today we'll continue with the rest of the discussion about the antipsychotic drugs, right? When we talk about antipsychotic drugs, all of you know by now that these drugs are basically classified into two major groups. Yes, please. What are those two groups? Typical antipsychotics or classical antipsychotics? Antipsychotic drugs, typical antipsychotic drugs, and there are, yes, modern or latest or atypical, yes, antipsychotic drugs, right? Let's compare and contrast them. Of course, it's easy to understand these were the drugs which were initially discovered and used from 1960s, right? They was called typical drugs or classical drugs or first generation drugs, and these are the drugs which are discovered later, right? And they are called atypical drug, or they are called modern drug, or they're called second generation drugs. Anyway, we'll stick with what most of the psychologists call or psychiatrists call typical and atypical drugs. Now, typical drugs typically block which receptors? Classically, they are anti-dopaminergic drugs. Typical drugs are classically anti-dopaminergic drugs, especially they block the D2 receptors. Is that right? They block antagonize reduce the action at D2 receptors, right? Atypical drug, remember, atypical drugs classically what we have seen that they block the serotonergic receptors, 5-hydroxytryptamine 2 receptors, right? They reduce the action on 5-hydroxytryptamine 2 receptors, or we simply call them, they reduce the action at serotonergic receptors because they are serotonergic receptors blocker. But the point which students forget unfortunately is, and you have to remember that even though they block serotonergic receptors, but they also block dopaminergic receptors. They reduce the activity at the D2 receptors as well. Is that right? Now, what is the real difference in D2 receptor activity here and there? Answer is that these drugs block the D2 receptors, yes, more potently, and they act on dopamine receptor for a longer time. Is that right? They have strong affinity. Affinity means tendency of a molecule to bind with receptor. They have a very, very strong affinity to bind with the receptors and block them, or they have a very, very potent drugs. As compared to that, atypical antipsychotic drugs, even though they block the serotonergic receptors, but now it is believed their antipsychotic action is still by blocking dopaminergic receptors, but they block the dopaminergic receptors with low affinity. They block the dopaminergic receptors with low affinity transiently, right? Now, why I'm trying to stress this thing in your mind? The reason being that most important side effect of antipsychotics are related with D2 receptor blockers. You must remember that there were a lot of extrapyramidal side effects. You remember? There were extrapyramidal side effects, especially dystonias. Yes? Yes, please. Dystonias. Parkinson's-like syndrome, like achynesias, and there were akathisias. You remember akathisia was motor restlessness. Now, these extrapyramidal side effects, all of them are due to, yes, anti-dopaminergic activity. They are due to anti-dopaminergic activity at, yes please, at basal ganglia or basal nuclei. Fine. Of course, one more side effect we add here is tardive dyskinesia. What is this? Tardive dyskinesias, which are long-term complication of use of typical antipsychotics, but that is due to increased dopaminergic activity. Dopaminergic activity. This is again very important that extrapyramidal side effects, the first three side effects, which are dystonias, Parkinsonism and akathisias, these are due to excessive anti-dopaminergic action. And tardive dyskinesias are due to excessive supersensitivity of dopamine receptors. So that is due to increased dopaminergic activity. Now, from here we can infer very easily, more a drug is potent for D2 receptor blocking action, more it will produce extrapyramidal side effects and more successful it will be antipsychotic. This was old theory. Old theory was that more a drug is potent in blocking the D2 receptors, more effective it will be antipsychotic, and more not only it will act on the mesolimbic pathway, but it will also act more potently on the basal ganglia, and more strong side effects will be seen related with the extrapyramidal side effects. Is that right? It means that next time if I say one drug is more potent in blocking D2 receptors as compared to the other one, then it means the first drug will be having stronger extrapyramidal side effects. Later on we'll learn remember that when we say a drug is more potent, we need its lower dose. Is that right? Now, opposite to that, these drugs, their affinity for D2 receptors are less. Is that right? So they produce less extrapyramidal side effects as well. But then we will wonder that if these drugs are producing less extrapyramidal side effects, how they act as antipsychotic. Now they believe that their action as antipsychotic agent is because they reduce the tonic action of dopaminergic pathways, hyperfunctioning dopaminergic pathway. Again, you know, dopaminergic pathways are have two types of activity, tonic activity and dopamine surge, right? These drugs block the tonic activity on the dopaminergic pathways in mesolimbic system. By that they reduce psychosis, especially positive symptoms of psychosis. But because they weakly bind with D2 receptors in basal ganglia, so when there is dopamine surge, these drugs are displaced from the receptor, so they don't produce any significant dysfunction in the basal ganglia activity. Is that right? That is why these drugs, which are atypical, they have less risk of extrapyramidal side effects. And this is one good news, right? Yeah, that is why now they are considered superior to typical drugs, because atypical drugs have less chance to produce or less risk of producing extrapyramidal side effects. So now they are considered superior to what? Typical drugs. Is that right? Again, I think it's worth mentioning again and again that these antipsychotic drugs, which are typical drugs, right? Because they block the dopamine system strongly, so they basically produce what problems? Extrapyramidal side effects strongly. Is that right? But when receptors which are blocked for a long time, they undergo, what is that? Upregulation. Is that right? Then they have a tendency to produce tardive dyskinesia. Do you think any other side effect or complication or dangerous complication is produced by these drugs in relation to their action on dopaminergic receptors? There's some very dangerous side effect of these drugs. That is neuroleptic syndrome. I mentioned previously neuroleptic syndrome. When we give typical antipsychotic drug to a person who is having very, very sensitive dopaminergic receptors, right? You remember that neuroleptic syndrome? Neuroleptic syndrome, even though rare, but it is potentially fatal. And it is also due to antipsychotic drugs, which are typical antipsychotic drugs, due to action on the dopaminergic receptors. Do you think such kind of side effect can be seen with atypical drugs? No. Is that right? So how atypical drugs are superior to typical? Answer should be that atypical drugs as a group, why they are considered superior to typical drugs? Simply because atypical drugs have less chances to produce side effects related with the dopaminergic system. So whole group of side effects are eliminated. Am I clear? No problem. But if someone asks in mechanism of action how they are different, typical and atypical, then you will say these are classically blocking D2 receptors. They do block classically serotonergic receptors, but they also block the D2 or other dopaminergic receptors as well. Right? Now let's come to another thing about efficacy of the drugs. These drugs are very, very effective, which are classical drugs or which are typical drugs. But atypical drugs are at least as effective as typical or more effective, because there are many atypical drugs. Some of the atypical drugs are as effective as typical ones, or some of them are even more effective, especially in regard to the handling of negative symptoms. Now this is very, very important information. You know, there are positive symptoms and there are negative symptoms, right? Actually, your typical drugs typically eliminate positive symptoms, because typical drugs are considered typically eliminating positive symptoms. What were the positive symptoms? Positive symptoms were due to excessive dopaminergic action in mesolimbic pathway, and positive symptoms were like hallucinations, delusions. Yes, what else? Positive symptoms. These are very, you can say positive symptoms are those symptoms in psychosis which are in addition to patient's normal personality. The patient has weird thoughts, or patient has bizarre delusions, or patient has auditory hallucinations, right? So these are positive symptoms. Opposite to that, there are negative symptoms. Negative symptoms mean the symptoms which are in a psychotic patient. These are the symptoms which are missing from his normal personality. Something is missing from normal behavior. Classically, negative symptoms include amotivational state, amotivational, no motivation, amotivational state. There's a lack of motivation. There's social, yes, social withdrawal, and what else is there? And negative symptoms, yes. Inability to derive pleasure from day-to-day small activities. Anhedonia. This is also a classical feature of depression. Anhedonia. Inability to derive pleasure out of small events of the life. Is that right? Some people simply call such situation as flattening of emotion. Flattening of emotions, or restricted range of emotion and restricted and reduced intensity of emotional display. Right? So these are negative symptoms. Again, it's worth mentioning that when we were using the only typical drugs, most of the psychotic patients, they were having reduced positive symptoms, but once the positive symptoms are eliminated or reduced, prominent symptoms which are left behind are negative symptoms. And they have seen that atypical antipsychotics are very effective in elimination of negative symptoms as well, right? So again, what is the real difference in these are typical drugs, these two are the typical drugs and these are atypical. What is the real difference? Typical drugs are typically crossing D2 receptors, blocking D2 receptors. These block also serotonergic receptors. Typical drugs are very, very potently acting on D2 receptors. So they produce more extrapyramidal side effects. And your atypical drugs have less chances to produce, or they do not produce extrapyramidal side effects. Then typical drugs typically eliminate positive symptoms. Atypical drugs eliminate positive symptoms as well as negative symptoms. Is that right? And what do you think that when you are going to use drugs, weight of evidence will go to which side? Typical or atypical?
Depending on the background, financial background.
Yeah, this is very important. He's worried about the patient's financial background. This is very true. That's true. Why still typical antipsychotics like chlorpromazines are used? The reason being they are inexpensive. Is that right? And atypical drugs are more expensive, but if patient can afford, then atypical drugs are considered superior over typical drugs. And not only the weight of evidence is in the favor of that, rather they also add to the weight of the patient. Right? This is one of the very important side effects of atypical drugs, that patients start putting up weight, and many of them stop the drugs for that. Right? Once they are out of psychosis, of course. Am I clear?
Weight gain is only with atypical.
Weight gain is more seen with the atypical drug as compared to the typical drugs. Typical drug may also lead to some weight gain, but weight gain is more seen with the atypical drugs. Now let's talk about some typical and atypical drugs. Let's name them. A very important group in case of typical drugs is, yes, very important group. There are three important groups. One is phenothiazines. Phenothiazines. First group. Second group is Yes. Second group is thioxanthines. Thioxanthines. And third group is butyrophenones. Butyrophenones. Right? Now, phenothiazines are further subclassified into three types. They are aliphatic chain. Aliphatic means open chain. Aliphatic chain drugs, right? Aliphatic chain drug and piperidine and piperazine. Piperidine group, these are ring, and piperazine. You are supposed to know at least one drug in each group. Here the drug is, which you are supposed to know, is chlorpromazine. Have you heard of it? Chlorpromazine, which is very commonly used, right? Chlorpromazine. And piperidine group, we have thioridazine. Here it is, thioridazine. And in case of piperazine, we have flufenazine. Flufenazine. So these are the three important drugs there. And in case of thioxanthines, the drug is thiothexine. Thiothexine. And butyrophenone is a very important drug, halo. Have you heard of it? Haloperidol. Now, few words about everything. First of all, chlorpromazine. This is one of the very commonly used inexpensive drug. Most of our discussion about the typical drug was actually relevant with chlorpromazine, right? Chlorpromazine is very widely used, especially in patients who are less affording financially. There are few points related with thioridazine. Thioridazine has three important points to be discussed. Number one, thioridazine is a very strong anticholinergic action. Anticholinergic drug. Do you think it's good for the patient or bad? It is good. The reason being that all these drugs are anti-dopaminergic. And you remember we have to keep a balance in basal ganglia, right? All these drugs, again, all this typical drug, there is dopaminergic activity here and cholinergic activity here. This has to be in balance. When you give typical antipsychotic, dopaminergic activity go down, and uncompensated increased action of cholinergic plus decreased dopaminergic action produce extrapyramidal side effects. Extrapyramidal side effects are produced by reduced dopaminergic activity plus due to uncompensated increased action of acetylcholine. So what really happens when you use the thioridazine, not only it blocks the dopaminergic activity, it also reduces cholinergic activity. So there is no significant imbalance in basal ganglia neurotransmitter business. So result is decreased extrapyramidal side effects. So actually, when patient has severe extrapyramidal side effects due to other drugs in the typical group, either you switch to the atypical antipsychotics, or if patient cannot be switched to the atypical antipsychotic due to maybe financial reason, then you should choose within the group of typical patient who has a high tendency to develop extrapyramidal side effects, you will choose the drug thioridazine. They have very strong anticholinergic effect that is beneficial in keeping the extrapyramidal side effects low, but of course anticholinergic action increases the chances of urinary retention, fecal retention, and anticholinergic action also produces malfunction of accommodation You know, there is a muscle in the eye which is responsible for adjustment of the lens. Ciliaris. Ciliary body has a ciliaris muscle. So ciliaris muscle has muscarinic receptors, they are blocked. So actually, a patient may develop, due to loss of accommodation function, patient may develop blurring of vision. So many patients who are having any type of drug with strong anticholinergic action, they have a tendency for blurring of vision due to cycloplegia. Cycloplegia is a term which is used for paralysis of ciliaris. Cycloplegia. So even though they are reduced by thioridazine, there is reduced you can say extrapyramidal side effect, but there is increased tendency for blurred vision, there is increased tendency for urinary retention and fecal retention. Of course, these drugs are not very good for elderly males especially, right? Of course, if there is anticholinergic action in central nervous system, especially in cerebral cortex, that may produce reduced memory and confusion. Anticholinergic drugs produce confusion when they act on cerebral cortex cholinergic system. Right? Another thing, when anticholinergic action is strong on the heart, that will produce, yes, cardiac arrhythmias. Autonomic control of the heart goes out of disturbance. So patient with thioridazine have high risk of developing cardiac arrhythmias. The only good point is that they have reduced extrapyramidal side effects. Another special thing, thioridazine produces some complications in the eyes. They may produce some pigmentation of retina and eventually may produce retinal dysfunction. Now we come to the next group, flufenazine. The best point about flufenazine is that it is available in depot form. It is available in depot form, right? Flufenazine deconoate, right? This compound is available in depot form, that if you inject in persons intramuscularly, this keep on working for 3-4 weeks. So this is a very good drug when you want to give to a patient, a psychotic patient who is not compliant to the drugs. Many patients, it's very difficult to give them chlorpromazine 3 times a day. They are not taking the drugs. They are not cooperative. So what you do, that once in a month you get hold of them and inject them, of course, flufenazine deconoate, right? And then for the rest of the month, drug keep on working, and then after 3 or 4 weeks, you again get hold of them and give them one intramuscular shot of flufenazine deconoate.
In order to maintain the equilibrium with cholinergic activity and dopaminergic activity, all the drugs other than thioridazine, you give
anticholinergic drugs. Yes, he has asked a very good question. Actually, if a patient is on the typical antipsychotic drugs and at the top, with that he develops extrapyramidal side effects, especially dystonias, Parkinson's-like achinesias and akathisias. All these are due to excessive antidopaminergic activity. These are all side effects due to excessive antidopaminergic activity. So we can give them anticholinergic drug to produce some balance in basal ganglia, and those anticholinergic drugs are benztropine, right? Those drugs can help you to reduce extrapyramidal side effects. Except thioridazine, in others we can use that, but you remember that may produce confusion, urinary retention, fecal retention and blurring of vision. Anticholinergic side effects, but we can use them. But remember one thing, some side effects which are produced by excessive dopaminergic activity, in those patients you will not use anticholinergic. For example, a patient who developed tardive dyskinesia, right, who was an antipsychotic and he developed tardive dyskinesia, they are having excessive dopaminergic activity. If you, unfortunately, if you give them anticholinergic, right, then what will happen? Tardive dyskinesia will get worse. Is that right? Okay, let me explain this concept. That side effects are 2 types of side effects except on motor system by these drugs. Some drugs which are due to increase antidopaminergic activity, and other group of side effects are due to increased dopaminergic activity. Dopaminergic activity. Now, side effects which are due to increased dopaminergic activity and due to increased anti-dopaminergic activity, these side effects will be reduced with these side effects will be reduced by giving anticholinergics. If there is excessive antidopaminergic activity in basal ganglia, you can do excessive anticholinergic activity to keep the balance. But if these side effects are like dyskinesias, Parkinson's-like problem, then dystonias and akathisias. But if someone has some complication which is due to excessive dopaminergic activity, for example, tardive dyskinesias or neuroleptic syndrome. Neuroleptic syndrome is acute excessive response to dopaminergic blockage. Is that right? And tardive dyskinesia is when you use the drugs chronically and eventually patient develops hypersensitive receptors. So tardive dyskinesia is a motor dysfunction which is produced due to increased dopaminergic action due to supersensitive receptors. In those cases, you should not use anticholinergic because dopaminergic activity is high. At the top, you use anticholinergic, what will happen? Patient will develop further imbalance. In these patients, what you will do? You will reduce the, what you will do? If you reduce the dose of antipsychotic drug in these patients, patient will get worse at least transiently. Because what is happening? They are having excessive dopaminergic activity, and when you reduce the dose of antipsychotic drug, it means that you are reducing a dose of antidopaminergic drug. Right? So this patient should be switched to the atypicals. That's good. Right? With that, we give diazepam. Actually, another interesting thing, a very important concept is that one patient has akinesia and other patient has, let's suppose I have a patient here who has akinesia or dyskinesia or dystonia or akathisia or Parkinson's-like situation, or right, all these are due to excessive dopaminergic blockade. Is that right? And we have two patients there, or one patient there who has tardive dyskinesia. Now, response of these patients in changing the dose of antipsychotic. If antipsychotic dose, if you want to, because here is this, all these problems are produced due to excessive block of the dopamine receptors. So if you reduce the drug, patient will become better. This group of patients where extrapyramidal side effects of motor problems are due to excessive blockage of dopaminergic system, when you reduce the dose of the drug, patient will get better. But there, in tardive dyskinesia, patient has a side effects due to tardive dyskinesia due to excessive dopaminergic activity. So in them, if you reduce the dose, patient will get worse, at least transiently. Or if you increase the dose, patient get better for a while. So response to the dose change is different in first group of patient and second group of patient. Again, patient who are having dystonias, if you increase the dose, patient gets worse. If you decrease the dose, patient gets better. Claro? Opposite to that, patient who has tardive dyskinesia, if you increase the dose, patient gets better. Because increasing dose means excessive dopaminergic activity is being blocked by the drug. But if you decrease the dose, at least transiently patient gets worse. Is that right? Okay. So we were talking about flufenazine, and important point was it is available in depot form also. Now we come to the about haloperidol. Haloperidol is very, very potent. Potent mean what? Even at low doses, it blocks the dopaminergic D2 receptors very effectively. So you need high doses of this drug or low doses of this drug? Low doses. Secondly, the extrapyramidal side effect frequency and intensity increases with potency of the drug. As drug become more potent in blocking the D2 receptors, it become more potent to produce antipsychotic action, and unfortunately it become more potent to produce extrapyramidal side effects. Are you understanding me? So haloperidol is very effective, but the sad part is that frequency and intensity of extrapyramidal side effect with haloperidol is very high, because not only they block the D2 receptors in the mesolimbic system effectively, but unfortunately they also block the D2 receptors in the nigrostriatal pathway also very, very effectively. Am I clear? So we can say it's a very, very potent drug, haloperidol, and result will be what? Logically it will lead to more and more extrapyramidal side effect. And good news is that it is also available in depot form. Right? Now, let's talk few words about atypical drugs. Right? We have already discussed atypical drugs not only block the D2 receptors, but they also block 5-hydroxytryptamine receptors, group 2. Atypical drugs, of course, because they bind the D2 receptors with less affinity, so the chances of producing extrapyramidal side effects are less, right? And they are as effective as typical drugs, or even some of them are more effective than the typical drugs, and classically they are very useful in case of negative symptoms. Not only positive symptoms are eliminated, but negatives are also eliminated. Now the drugs which are in that group, one drug is clozapine. Clozapine, right. I think I should draw with it. What does it tell you? Very, very toxic drug. Look, it's very effective drug. We still use it, but unfortunately, it is a small but definite risk of a very fatal complication. That is agranulocytosis. In 1 to 2% of the patient, who are on clozapine, right? Clozapine attacks the bone marrow house. Especially, stem cell divide into myeloid stem cell and lymphoid stem cell. Then one of the myeloid stem cell is going to produce granulocytes. Granulocytes are classically your three cells, neutrophils, eosinophils and basophils. Actually, clozapine has a high tendency to destroy the granulopoiesis in 1 to 2% of the patient. And if granulocyte number goes down in the blood, right, that may produce very severe infections. Right? Patient may not die of psychosis, but patient may definitely die of severe agranulocytosis, right, which lead to severe infections. So what we really do, that any patient who is prescribed or put on clozapine, for first 6 months of the treatment, every week we do blood counts. Every week we do blood counts, because if granulocyte numbers start going down, we should withdraw the drug, and in early stages, usually it is reversible. Is that right? At least for 6 months. And after 6 months, they may do it every second week or every third week. Right? So clozapine is very good drug. It can block the receptor D1, D2, D3, D4, D5, plus it can block 5-hydroxytryptamine receptors, right? But with all that thing, it blocks your bone marrow granulopoiesis activity, especially in 1 to 2% of the patient. Then another drug is olanzapine. Remember, remaining atypical drugs do not produce bone marrow toxicity, right? Olanzapine is a good drug because it is useful in so many things. Not only it is antipsychotic, it is also anti-anxiety. It is also antidepressants. It is also antidepressant, and it is anti-manic. And surprisingly, it is also effective in OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. I think in third world especially, some of the psychiatrists who don't know how to differentiate the different diseases, any person come with some psychiatric problem. Maybe it's a very wrong way to practice, putting them on olanzapine, right? So that anything is there will be cured. Because if patient is psychotic, get benefit from olanzapine. If patient has anxiety, still getting better. If patient has depression, still getting better. If patient is anti-manic, still getting better. Even patient with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, also get better. Remember, about all these antipsychotic drugs, they take few weeks to start their actions. Bad thing is that many of these drugs start their side effects first and effects later. This is the sad part of the story. Right? Anyway, so I was telling you, olanzapine should be remembered as it has many, you can say, action on many different type of psychiatric disorders. Then there are similar drugs like quetiapine, ziprasidone, quetiapine, ziprasidone. Ziprasidone has some problem, it can produce cardiac arrhythmias because ziprasidone produces prolonged QT interval. QT interval mean, this is from beginning of the Q wave up to the end of the T wave. Actually, they prolong the duration of action potential, right? By blocking the potassium efflux. When potassium channels cannot bring the potassium out, then naturally repolarization becomes delayed. So QT interval is prolonged. Again, QT interval is the duration between from the beginning of the QRS complex up to the end of the T wave. What really happens, many drugs, not only ziprasidone, many drugs prolong the QT interval. How they prolong the QT interval? Actually, the drugs which are QT interval prolonger, they basically block the potassium efflux during repolarization state. And when potassium cannot get out of the myocardial cells, potassium coming out is slow, so repolarization is delayed because repolarization depends on potassium efflux, right? So when repolarization is delayed, so naturally then T wave will be appearing delayed. So QT interval is prolonged. Is that right? And when QT interval is prolonged, that increases the risk for ventricular tachyarrhythmias. The special type of tachyarrhythmias which are produced. We call them torsades. Have you heard of torsades? Have you heard of them? Torsades de pointes. But it is French word, so we read it torsades. So actually any drug or any inherited disorder of the channels produces prolonged QT interval that has a tendency to produce a special type of arrhythmia which is called torsades. What are torsades? What is meant by torsades? Twisting of the points. Which points? Twisting of the point. Which points twist? Don't tell me wrong things. Yes. Twisting of which points? Points of QRS complex. In these arrhythmias, what really happens? Patient has, for example, I just draw QRS complex. QRS complex initially coming like this, then suddenly they become like this. Then again coming like this, like again coming like this. This type of, you can say, ECG pattern seen in ventricular arrhythmias, tachyarrhythmias of course, are called torsades, right? These are typically seen when potassium channels are dysfunctioning, those potassium channels which are responsible for potassium efflux for repolarization. And many drugs block these potassium channels. Actually, if you remember antiarrhythmic drugs, there's a whole group of antiarrhythmic drugs which are potassium channel blockers. All of them have a tendency to prolong QT interval, and all of those drugs have a tendency to produce torsades. Right? So ziprasidone is one of that. Then there is another drug that is in this group, risperidone. Right, then there is molendone. Molendone remind me something. Molendone is a drug which is favorably used in patient with, okay, I will tell you the clinical situation, you tell me what's wrong. Usually this is small children and they are having motor tics. You know motor tics? The motor tics with obscene language and obscene gesture. Tourette syndrome. Tourette? Have you heard of Tourette syndrome? You never heard of it? Okay, Tourette syndrome is a situation actually where there is a neurotransmitter dysfunction in basal ganglia, especially in caudate nucleus. Right? In caudate nucleus is one part of the basal ganglia, of course, concerned with your motor movement. And caudate is also concerned with your emotionality. Now it is discovered. Right? So what really happens that they have inherited defect in neurotransmission business in caudate nucleus. Right? And these children, they have motor tics, right? Repetitive purposeless motor activities. And with that, they communicate with obscene language an obscene gesture. For example, if 22-year-old boy is talking like this, we may think testosterone is doing something big. But if there's an 8-year-old boy doing too much obscene language and everything he has to explain by special type of gestures, I think you understand, use your imagination. So maybe he needs some drug like Melendon. And they have seen that when they use the Melendon drugs, they calm down and their tics go down, and even their hyper obscene gestures and vocal tics, all those go down. Is that right? Melendon is effective there. Then another drug is aripiprazole, and there's something special about that. Aripiprazole. This is one of the latest atypical antipsychotic drug, and it is a very different type of mechanism of action. It is partial agonist on D2 receptors and partial agonist on 5-hydroxytryptamine 2 receptors. It means it partially stimulates and partially blocks. You have the concept of partial agonist and full agonist and antagonist. Do you have concept? It's fine. If you don't have, I will explain in 2-3 minutes. Yes. Do you have a clear concept? What is meant by the antagonist, agonist, and partial agonist? I explain a little bit. Okay. It's a very simple diagram I'm going to draw. Let's suppose this is a cell. These are different cells with different receptors, and we see action of the drugs on them. Let's suppose this is a receptor here, right? Now look, and this is a drug here. Okay, a drug should be different color. Now this is a drug here, will bind with this receptor. When this drug binds with this receptors give, let's suppose, these 4 signals in. Now listen, binding of the drug, ability of a drug to bind with the receptor is called affinity. Ability of a drug to bind with the receptor is called affinity. And ability of a drug to stimulate the receptor is called intrinsic activity. If a drug binds with a receptor, that is called affinity. And if drug bind and then stimulates receptor, that is called intrinsic activity. Now, this drug is having affinity plus intrinsic activity. Affinity means it has capability to bind with the receptor. And after binding, because it stimulates the receptor and receptor has displayed its signaling mechanism, it means that not only it binds but it also activates the receptor. So this is a drug which has affinity plus intrinsic activity. Such drugs are called agonist drug. What are these called? Agonist drug. And if they can bind and stimulate it fully, we call them full agonist. Full agonist. Clear? Now, let's go to another example. This is the same receptor. Now another drug comes. It has also affinity, but its intrinsic activity is half than this is drug A, this is drug B. Is that right? Drug B lead to still stimulation of the receptor but less. And it does not allow, suppose, drug A to work. It does not allow. Is that right? Now in this case, we'll say drug B is having affinity with partial intrinsic activity, because it is not producing the full action. Full action is produced by A, B is producing partial activation. So we say it has affinity with partial intrinsic activity. Such drugs are called partial agonist. What they are called? Partial, yes, agonist. They are also called partial antagonist because they antagonize the action of the full agonist. This drug does not allow the full agonist to work. So they are partial agonist and partial antagonist. Is that right? For example, again, let me tell you, if this is your SA node, if this drug A is like norepinephrine. Norepinephrine takes your heart rate from 60 to 100. Norepinephrine is taking your heart rate 60 to 100. Now another drug comes which bind there. Is that right? And heart rate is from 60 to 80. So it is acting like partial agonist. But now you give norepinephrine. Can norepinephrine in the presence of this drug, can you take it to 100? No. So there it will act in the presence of norepinephrine as partial antagonist. Is that right? Am I really clear?
Why is not full agonist? Because it's totally binding now, throwing away norepinephrine.
Look, for example, listen. It's a very funny example. Let's suppose you are standing there, someone comes and put you 2 kicks and you give 2 cries. Maybe that person is full agonist. Then another friend come unfortunately put you 1 kick to you. You give 1 cry. What do you think? What is that? Partial agonist. At least he got some action from you, 1 cry. But this single kick person does not allow the other person to put a double kick to you. So at least he antagonizes those cruel people. Is that right? And there's another friend who, or rather girlfriend I should say, just hold and protect you. But no action. It is sad, but still better than kicks. Is that right? So what is that? Antagonist. Right? I hope you understand or not yet?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. So we come to third situation. Here the third drug comes. It does bind here and here, but does not bind to those points where stimulation could occur. So there is no intrinsic stimulation. So there is affinity but no intrinsic activity. So this drug is antagonist. Why? Because it does not allow the full agonist to work. In the presence of this drug, full agonist cannot have its action. Is that clear? Now, so what really happens? Full agonist is a drug which has full affinity with full intrinsic activity. Partial agonist which has full affinity but partial intrinsic activity. Antagonist drug which has full affinity but no intrinsic activity. Alright, what is this? Antagonist drug. Am I really clear to you guys? Have you, okay, if you really are interested to learn, there is another term which is used, reverse agonist. Okay, that I will teach you in somewhere else. There is another term used, agonist antagonist. Have you heard of agonist antagonist drug? Especially when you study opioid drugs. Some opioids are strongly agonist. Some opioid drugs are antagonists. Some drugs are agonist antagonist. And don't confuse agonist antagonist drug with partial agonist or partial antagonist. Look, actually, opioid receptors are 5 types. If a drug comes, it stimulates 2 receptors and block 3. So it is agonist on 2 and antagonist on 3. It is agonist, antagonist. Again, listen. These are 5 receptors. If a drug comes, bind with all of them and stimulate them fully. What is that? Agonist. Another drug comes which bind with them but partially stimulate all of them. What is that? Partial agonist. For example, all of them are these are dopamine 1 receptor, dopamine 2, dopamine 3, 4 and 5. Drug which bind with all dopamine receptors and stimulate all of them fully, this is full agonist. Drug which bind with some of the bind with all the dopamine receptors, right? Or even bind with some dopamine receptors, but it does not bind at all with others. But bind with some and stimulate partially, it is partial agonist. Or drug which bind with all of them and do partial stimulation, still partial agonist. Clear? Or in the presence of full agonist, partial agonist work as partial antagonist. In the presence of full agonist, partial agonists work as partial antagonists because they prevent the action of the full agonist. Am I clear? Then we come to another group of drug which bind with all the receptors, but they do not stimulate any one of them. What are they? Antagonist. They have affinity but no intrinsic activity. Now we come with another drug. We stimulate 2 receptors and inhibit other receptors. They are agonist, antagonist. Am I really clear? No problem. Why I explain this? Because up to now I was telling that all the drugs which we have discussed, except the last drug, all the drugs were blocking the either dopamine receptors or they were also blocking the 5-hydroxytryptamine receptors. So all of them were antagonists. Is that right? But when I talk about the last drug, which was aripiprazole, what was that? Aripiprazole. I said this is partial agonist to D2 receptors, and aripiprazole is partial agonist to 5-hydroxytryptamine receptor. So it means that they are like this drug, aripiprazole. They bind with the dopamine receptors. Themselves they produce some action, but they don't allow the dopamine to produce full action. Is that right? So aripiprazole is partial agonist or also partial antagonist. They have found this drug has also antipsychotic action. Is that right? Because they don't allow the endogenous dopamine or endogenous serotonin they prevent the full action of endogenous dopamine and endogenous serotonin. Am I clear? Okay. Now we come to some indications of the antipsychotic drugs. Of course, at the top there must be which disease? Psychosis. We have discussed so many side effects of antipsychotic drugs, but we did not mention about the allergic reactions. Like other drugs, antipsychotic drugs can also produce allergic reaction in our body. They may produce allergic skin reactions, or they may produce hypersensitivity reaction against liver and jaundice, or they may produce hypersensitivity reaction against bone marrow, agranulocytosis. Clozapine should come to your mind. And these drugs can also produce an unusual type of problem. The most of the typical antipsychotic drugs reduce the threshold for seizure. They reduce the threshold for seizure. It means in patients who are epileptic patients, we have to be careful in using typical antipsychotic drugs because chances of precipitation of epileptic attack are more. Is that right? Now, I think we have a break and then we'll continue. Now a few words about the pharmacokinetics of these drugs. Most of these drugs are taken orally. It means they have to be absorbed from GIT. But you must be knowing that any drug which is absorbed from the GIT, it has to pass through the liver, isn't it? And in the liver, naturally, through the portal circulation, it breaks down into sinusoidal flow, and then through hepatic veins, it will go out into systemic, yes, circulation. And from there to the systemic veins, it will eventually, drug will go to the right heart and passing through the, yes, through the lungs, drug will eventually come to the left heart and then it will go to the all body. Is that right? This is systemic circuit. Now, listen carefully. Actually, this is a basic rule. All the drugs which work in the central nervous system, they must be highly lipid soluble. The basic rule is all the drugs which work on the central nervous system must be highly lipid soluble because they must have a capacity to cross blood-brain barrier. They must have a capacity to cross the blood-brain barrier. Now, any drug which is highly lipid soluble, right, that will not only cross the blood-brain barrier, that will also absorb easily from GIT. And that any drug which can cross blood-brain barrier will always cross the placental barrier. Is that right? Because absorption for GIT mucosa, it requires the drug should dissolve into lipids, membranes of the cells. From the systemic circulation going to the central nervous system requires the drug should pass through the blood-brain barrier, and if a female is pregnant, if drug has to pass from maternal circulation to the baby, then it need to cross the placental barrier. So the drugs which are highly lipid soluble, they have something common, that they are absorbed from GIT very well. Now all those drugs, like antipsychotic drugs, they work on the central nervous system. So they must be highly lipid soluble. Because these drugs are highly lipid soluble, so whenever they are taken orally, they are effectively absorbed. But when they are passing through the portal circulation and they are passing through the liver, because these drugs are highly lipid soluble, they go into hepatocytes. While they are passing through the liver, they dissolve into hepatocyte membrane and they load the hepatocyte. And in the hepatocytes, there is a lot of endoplasmic reticulum. More a drug is lipid soluble, more drug will get dissolved into endoplasmic reticulum of hepatocyte. And this is the hepatic endoplasmic reticulum, which is very rich in drug metabolizing enzymes. Right? These are what? Drug metabolizing enzymes. Drug metabolizing enzymes or proteins are floating in the lipids of endoplasmic reticulum in the hepatocyte. So more a drug is lipid soluble, more effective it will absorb from the GIT, more it will be trapped into hepatocytes, more it will be dissolved into endoplasmic reticulum, more chances it will be catabolized before it goes to the systemic circulation. And the amount of drug which is catabolized, when amount of drug which is catabolized before it reaches to systemic circulation, that amount of drug is called the amount of drug undergoing first pass effect. What is first pass effect? That whenever we take a drug orally, if this drug, some part of the drug is destroyed in the GIT or in portal circulation, or part of a drug is destroyed in the liver, anywhere. Drug is destroyed in GIT or in portal circulation or in the liver, right? If drug is being destroyed, then a smaller percentage reaches systemic circulation. So we say, if I say there's a drug which has 70% first pass effect, it means out of 100 molecules which are absorbed, only 30 will reach to the systemic circulation. If I say a drug has no first pass effect, it means whatever amount of drug is absorbed, all of it is reaching to the systemic circulation without any significant catabolism. Now, as I told you, the drugs which act on the central nervous system, as a principle, they must be highly lipid soluble. So all of them can be taken orally. This is a basic principle. But all of them have a tendency to undergo first pass metabolic effect. Especially you look at diazepams, benzodiazepines, or you talk about barbiturate, or you talk about anti-epileptic drugs, or you talk about as a group antipsychotic drugs. All these drugs have significant first pass effect. So it's not just memorizing the drugs. Just remember one thing, drug which is taken orally and for action ending up into CNS must be highly lipid soluble. So two things are evident immediately. They have a chance that they will be highly lipid, they will be highly undergoing first pass effect. Secondly, they have a high chance to pass through what? Pass through placental barrier also. So they may produce toxicity to the baby. Is that right? Now another important thing, all the drugs which are highly lipid soluble, if they go to systemic circulation, how they will be carried? They must be strongly bound with plasma proteins. Because lipid soluble drug, if they don't bind with the plasma protein, they cannot be kept into blood into proper solution form and transported. Is that right? So by simple discussion, I say antipsychotic drugs are acting in central nervous system. Do you think you need to memorize this thing? There's no fun in memorizing. Everyone understands psychosis must be something wrong with the central nervous system. Antipsychotic drugs must be going to central nervous system. So it's easy to understand. They must be orally absorbable drug. They must be passing through high first pass metabolic effect. They must be strongly binding with plasma protein. Of course, they must be capable of crossing blood-brain barrier. And of course, they must be able to cross placental barrier. And of course, to get these drugs out of the body, we have to convert these highly lipid soluble drug into water soluble drug. It means we have to convert these lipid soluble drug into metabolites which are more polar metabolites. So it means all of these drugs to get out of the body, they have to undergo biotransformation reactions in the liver. Biotransformation reactions are defined as the reactions in the liver which alter the drug. Is that right? So many of these drugs, which are antipsychotic drugs, in the liver, they are converted into more polar metabolites, and those more polar water soluble metabolites are easily eliminated by the renal in the urine, or they are easily eliminated by the fecal matter. Am I clear? Is it difficult or easy to understand all this basic principle? Clear? Now we come to the uses of antipsychotic drugs. Of course, at the top must be schizophrenia, which is a very typical type of unfortunate situation. Right? So uses are schizophrenia. Then second group of uses are schizoaffective disorders. Schizoaffective. Affective disorder mean mood disorders. So schizoaffective disorders mean psychiatric disorders in which this pathology of the disease is mixture of schizophrenia and mood disorders. Schizoaffective disorders. Right? Patient who have schizophrenia with mood disorders. Or it can be used in patient with psychosis which may be due to drugs, or psychosis which is due to toxins, or these drugs can be used in antipsychotic drugs, right? So we call it simply toxic psychosis. In those conditions, these drugs can be used. Then these drugs can be used in psychotic states associated with severe depression or severe mania. In severe mania and severe depression, patient loses the contact with reality and patient may develop some degree of psychosis. Then antipsychotic drugs can be used. Then antipsychotic drugs can be used in Tourette's syndrome. Tourette's syndrome. Tourette syndrome, I told you, this is maybe inherited familial disorder in which caudate nucleus neurotransmission is disturbed and children may develop motor tics with vocal tics, motor tics plus vocal tics plus obscene gestures and obscene language. Then these drugs can be used in intractable hiccup as a symptomatic treatment. Intractable hiccup, right, especially chlorpromazine can be used for that purpose. And again, in Tourette syndrome, we use Molendon, or another drug which can be used in Tourette syndrome is Pimozide, P-I-M-O-Z-I-D, Pimozide. Then sometimes a special drug in this group is used for intractable pruritus, itching. Intractable pruritus, the drug which is used for this purpose is promethazone. Then these drugs can be used in emesis. Emesis mean vomiting, severe vomiting. Some of these drugs are anti-emetic also, especially prochlorperazine. Right, they can be used in emesis as anti-emetic agent. Then there is a special type of anesthesia which is called neuroleptic anesthesia. Neuroleptic anesthesia, I will discuss about that anesthesia in detail when I teach you anesthetic agents. But in neuroleptic anesthesia, we use droperidol. The drug is droperidol plus with droperidol we use fentanyl. What is fentanyl? Fentanyl, NYL. Oh, no, that is phenytoin antiarrhythmic. Fentanyl is I think opioid drug, short-acting opioid drug, highly lipid soluble. Right? So we call it neuroleptic anesthesia, droperidol and fentanyl. So these are the basic uses of antipsychotic drugs, and thank God this topic finishes. Thank you.